This event occurred when I was 10 years old on Halloween night. At the time, I was still a stick-thin girl with nothing to actually distinguish that I was a girl. Especially since earlier that year, I decided I didn't want to be confused with my twin sister anymore. So I'd gotten a pixie cut and I had began dressing in black. At the time, I had no girlfriends, but up the road half a mile was my friend Austin and another mile and a half up, Quinn. I had really become close with them and would often go exploring and fishing with them, so it was only natural that we decided that the three of us would go trick-or-treating together. Compared to Austin in my neighborhood, Quinn's was the more wealthier one, so in hopes of getting the best candy, we decided we'd go to Quinn's. I had been to Quinn's house a few times, but most of the time we hung out, we'd walk another mile up from Quinn's to the Rudders, which was our local gas station for Slurpees, and then another 2 miles down from my house to the park and lake. So Austin and I weren't too familiar with this neighborhood and the ones around it. But I digress. My mother had a new boyfriend at the time, so she didn't really care what I was doing. She would have gotten mad if she'd known I was hanging out with boys again. It was Pennsylvania, so it was super cold. So any costume I had on was pretty much covered with my jacket and leggings. I had been a dark fairy, so you could still guess what I was just because of the black sparkly wings. Anyways, I had left early to go walk to Austin's house. When I got there, I had to ask Austin what he was because he was in a white button-up, black dress pants, as well as a tie and a heavy black jacket over it. He moved his jacket to show me the cheap sheriff's badge attached to his belt and told me he was a detective. I had laughed and his parents shooed us away. I remember his dad grumbling about what was a boy doing with sparkly wings, when I then realized he'd been talking about me, which definitely dampened my spirits. Austin's dad was drinking though, so I didn't correct him. Austin attempted to cheer me up the entire way to Quinn's house, and soon all was forgotten. Quinn's house was the biggest house I had ever been at the time. It was in a really nice neighborhood with houses on each side that looked just like his. Quinn's mother welcomed us warmly, and she had gave us treats to start off our trick-or-treating. Quinn definitely had the best costume of all of us. A realistic-looking Grim Reaper robe with a black screen over the face, with red glowing eyes, and a plastic bloody sheath. Quinn's neighborhood was swamped with kids from my school, and soon we had gone through almost the entire neighborhood, with our bags really weighing us down. It was getting late, but Quinn wanted us to continue on, and Austin and I were in no rush to go home, so we agreed despite how dark it was getting. Quinn had told us that there was a shortcut to the other neighborhood through his backyard if we went down the hill and then through the trees for a while. Now, that kind of freaked me out, but being the only girl, I wasn't about to let on that I was scared. So I gulped when this was suggested, but nodded my approval, and off we went. Quinn had taken off his mask to better see as we stumbled down Quinn's backyard and decides to leave his sheath behind. We start through the woods, and within about 5 minutes of walking and joking, we all then realized that none of us had thought to bring a flashlight. But it was fall, so there were no leaves on the trees, and light from the moon really helped to light up the way, if only enough not to walk into a tree. Austin asks how much longer, and I can tell by the hitch in his voice that he likes this shortcut just about as much as I do. Before Quinn can answer, we hear a crunch from somewhere up ahead of us, and we all freeze as Quinn sticks up a hand in the air to silence us. "Did you guys hear that?" Quinn says. I remain silent, but Austin snorts and replies, "Stop it, Quinn. That's not going to work. You're not going to scare us." Quinn gasps and then says, "I'm not joking. I really thought I heard something." And before I can tell them both just to keep walking, a shape in the darkness catches my eyes. It's up ahead of us, maybe 20 feet. It's dark, so I can't really distinguish anything, but it's only a moment later that no guessing is needed.
"Well, hey there, boys,"
came a strange man's reply from the spot. Quinn and Austin turn in horror as the man continues to walk towards us. "What? Who are you?" stammers Quinn. With this, a deep laugh bellows out of the man.
Oh, me? I'm the devil.
This whole time he's walking closer to us, but in the silhouette of darkness, I see no signs of this man wearing a costume. No horns or anything. This is my property. What are you doing in the woods? Quinn demands, sounding less brave with each syllable.
Oh, me? I'm just out for a stroll. I don't really get out nearly as often as I'd like.
He responds smoothly. Now he's about 10 feet from us, halfway peeking out from behind a tree. Quinn, let's just get out of here, I say. But Quinn, in a moment of bravery or stupidity, which is debatable, yells out to the man. What the hell's wrong with you? Stop talking to us. We're just trying to get through. And with that, Quinn nudges Austin and I and begins making a wide turn around the man, who silently watches us and spins around the tree with just his head and hands sticking out to watch us as we walk past. Austin then says to me, "It's Halloween. He's just trying to scare us." I don't respond, just keep my eyes locked on the man. He then yells,
I hope I haven't scared you boys. I just really like your costumes. Why don't you come closer and let me have a better look?
Immediately that comment sent up red flags to me, because you couldn't tell what Austin was, especially at a distance, and with Quinn's hood and sheath gun, you couldn't tell what he was either. That left me, and I didn't like that.
Hey you, boy with the wings. Come over here. Let me help you fly.
And with that, he just started laughing again. Now, I had been getting bullied for how short my hair was, and Quinn and Austin knew how much it hurt me every time I was mistaken for a boy, so they had taken up to sticking up for me, and unfortunately, tonight was no exception. "Hey, stop talking to her, you creep," Austin yelled, and with that, he picked up a rock and threw it at the man. It bounced off the tree where the man was half covered, and the man suddenly did a creepy little half jump, half dance, and clapped his hands.
Her? You're a girl? That's even better."
And with that, he, much like a wild animal, bounded forward, hands first on all fours. I immediately dropped my candy, and all three of us began screaming our heads off and running. I don't think he chased us long, but with the crunching under our feet and our screams, it was pretty much impossible to tell. I quickly had to abandon my wings too, as they continued to get stuck to branches as we weaved through the trees in pure terror. We didn't stop until we made it through the trees and onto a well-lit street, though there were very few kids out at this point anyway. We were now over 15 minutes away from Quinn's house and probably an hour plus walk back to my house, and it was only getting later. Quinn had dropped his bag too. Only Austin kept his, clutching it like it were a child. We took the long-lit way back to Quinn's house in almost complete silence, terrified the man would appear again, but he didn't. When we actually made it, we frantically explained what happened, and though sympathetic, Quinn's mom said we couldn't call the police. She said that nothing had happened, and we had no description of the man, and that it was Halloween. The man was probably long gone, and also was almost definitely just trying to scare us. She drove Austin and I home, and I ended up getting grounded for being out so late and also leaving my costume behind. I didn't even bother to explain what had happened, and she didn't seem to notice that I had no candy. The next day, though, I couldn't go out because I was grounded. Quinn came over with his mom and gave me a bag of candy that they had bought, because he knew I had lost mine in the woods. We never talked about it again after that, all convincing ourselves that it was probably just some creepy Halloween prank that went too far. So did the devil, or whoever you are. I really, really hope to never see you again, and especially on Halloween.
Came off Star is typing.
Is anyone else bored? I don't want to play Gmod anymore, and I don't want to play 4 more hours of Battlefield 1.
JRev13 is typing.
Nah, man. I'm having fun. It's just you.
LMR Legend is typing.
Yeah, I'm bored too. Let's go do some other shit. I lean back in my chair and close my eyes, It was 4 a.m., and I had school tomorrow. My friends finally convinced me to pull an all-night gaming marathon. I sighed, knowing that I would regret this in the morning, and finally forced myself to open my eyes. We gotta pass the time somehow. We got like 2.5 hours left until school. What do you guys suggest? Hey, how about World of Tanks? I thought about it for a second, but World of Tanks was really not my type of game. If anything, I wanted to play some Rainbow Six Siege, but nobody else in my group liked it. They thought it was really slow-paced and wasn't a lot of fun. Yeah, no, f*** World of Tanks. Too gritty anyways, and not fun enough to grind for good tanks. Yeah, man, I guess I can agree with that. Hey, can we start a group call or something? I'm sick of typing. Hell no. My ears hurt from wearing this headset for 8 hours, and I don't want to hear you guys talking into it. I just want to play. Sound off, KK?
Martin has joined this room.
Who the f*** is Martin? I got no clue. Who invited him? Yeah, not me. Hey, Martin, who the f*** are you?
Martin is typing.
Hello, friend.
Alright, which one of you guys is using an alternate account? I'm not prone to spooks. Good effort, though. Hey man, I'm not doing it. Yeah, same here. Kick him maybe? Yeah, I got it. I place my hand on the mouse and click on Martin's name. What came up was a profile with no name, bio, and a solid black profile picture. Scrolling down, I discovered that the account had only been made a few days before. Okay, seriously, who the f*** is doing it? The account was made like a few days ago. It's not me, man. Hey, just kick him already, and let's go play something. Alright. I'm really curious to see which one of you guys did it. I right-clicked on Martin and multiple options came up. I clicked on kick, and clicked out of the menu. Okay, he should be gone now. It was probably Legend though, man.
Martin is typing.
Seriously, it's one of you. And if you don't tell me, I'll kick you. I promise.
Group call started.
I nearly fell out of my chair, not realizing that my speakers were actually not muted. The sudden ring caught me off guard. I quickly hit mute on the speakers and turned back to the screen.
Martin, LMI Legend, plus one other person are calling.
I was starting to worry. This was just too bizarre to ignore. I tried kicking Martin again, but it didn't work. Confused, I looked at the call pop-up. Whoever this was, I decided that I should at least play along for now. I moved the mouse over to the green pickup call button and clicked. The text to the chat room was replaced by the call screen, showing the profile picture of my two friends, along with the solid black profile picture that this Martin guy had. I quickly plugged in my headphones and put them on. Breathing. The sound of someone breathing into their microphone was what I was greeted with. When I put on my headphones, it was extremely loud, like the person had the microphone right up to their mouth. The microphone clearly did not have a pop filter, as the breathing came out loud and distorted. I quickly turned down my volume, as the breathing was beginning to hurt my head. In the background I heard both of my friends talking, but I simply could not make out what they were saying. After a little while, both of my friends hung up. Putting my hand on the mouse, I began moving it towards the red hang up button, but I was interrupted by a sudden change on my screen. The solid black square of a profile picture was replaced with a loading icon. This Martin person was turning on their camera. Now here's something that you need to know about me. Whenever I see something on the internet that I simply doubt, I will ask questions. If somebody shows me a supposedly haunted video, I usually just end up laughing and counter it with simple logic. However, what I saw was something completely different. It was not a hoax. What I saw was real. The loading icon disappeared and was replaced with an image. Black. That was the first thing I saw. Then, I saw a slight movement. As I examined the darkness more and more, I realized that I was seeing somebody walking. At first, I wasn't sure where, but then I saw grass. It wasn't very visible, but I saw it. Suddenly the darkness was replaced by a bright light. The person walking had just turned on a flashlight. I looked closely and saw grass, as well as a tree in the distance. The person then turned around, and my blood ran cold with terror. I realized exactly where the man was. When he turned around, he pointed the camera at a house. It was pitch black, except for a single bright and slightly yellow glow coming from the second-floor window. Right next to the man was my father's grill, with folding chairs placed around it. To the far right of the house, I saw the small garden shed that we had, specifically used for storing tools. The man was standing in my backyard. I leapt out of my chair and ran downstairs to make sure both the front and back doors were locked. Realizing that they were, I ran back upstairs and looked at my screen. Scrolled down past the countless messages of my friends, asking me if I was okay, or if I was asleep, to see a single message from Martin.
I go in now.
I looked to the single window in my room, overlooking the backyard. My backyard was mostly empty, with almost nothing but a tree in the middle. On the tree stood a man, a very tall yet thin man. This man was wearing almost nothing, other than some tore-up jeans and a shirt. He must have triggered the motion sensor garden lights, as the whole garden was now lit up. I could see almost every detail, and what I saw terrified me. The man was crouching on a branch, with a crazed spark in his eyes. His mouth was now stretched into a wide, insane grin, and I could see his horrible, rotten yellow teeth. In his hand, he held a mobile phone and a flashlight. Suddenly, he tossed the flashlight and his phone to the side. He leapt down off the tree and towards the back door of the house. I heard loud banging noises and what sounded like wailing coming from downstairs. My parents burst through my door, asking me what the hell was going on. My younger brother stood by their side, grasping at my father's leg. I didn't know what to say, so I just told them that there was a man downstairs trying to get in. They rushed downstairs and told me to lock my brother in the upstairs bathroom. Holding my brother's hand, we walked together towards the bathroom, closing and locking the door. I sprinted downstairs towards the back door and almost vomited. The insane man was dragging the body of my father along the ground. I screamed and locked the back door, only to see the insane man dash towards the door through the door's window. Stumbling back in fear, I ran to the upstairs bathroom and asked my brother to unlock the door. He complied, and I rushed in, locking it behind me. I have been sitting in this damned bathroom for hours, with nothing but my brother and my laptop. My little brother keeps telling me that he's hungry. I don't know if I can take much more of this, but starving to death seems better than confronting that monster. My laptop is almost dead now, and I don't know what to do. A few hours back, I heard the sound of a window sliding open, and for the last hour I've been hearing this insane babbling, as well as the sound of footsteps, and it sounds as if this thing is running all over the house, looking for us. The worst part is 5 minutes ago it all stopped. I no longer heard footsteps or the insane babbling. The banging is gone as well. The worst part is that deep down, I want those sounds to come back, because anything is better than listening to this thing sit patiently outside my door, breathing and scratching at the handle.
I used to live with the biggest idiot on the face of the earth. Hector was this 6-foot Afro-Latino dude from New Jersey who had two distinct modes of being. Either he was a tornado of anger, or he was manically laughing at something. Rarely was there any in between. When you caught him in his laughing mood, he was tolerable at best, but catch him in one of his angry moods and he was totally unbearable. He was a roadie for some post-hardcore band that toured up and down the East Coast a bunch, which was one of the few good things about being his roommate. The fact that he spent weeks away at a time from the apartment but still paid rent. But whenever he was home, well, here's an example. It's July in East Harlem. I have the windows open. Latin brass band music is flowing through the afternoon air from some other open window, and I'm sipping Southern Peach lemonade like life is good. Out of nowhere, Hector bursts into the apartment, covered in brick dust like, "I need bricks, bro. You got bricks?" I just started driving Uber while trying to get my stand-up career up and running, so no, I didn't have any bricks. And even if I did, I wouldn't have been sharing them with Hector. And suddenly he's like, "There's bricks on the roof." And as he runs out of the apartment and towards the stairwell of the building, I hear these kids shouting from outside the window. Then I look out to see this group of kids, like 11-year-old kids, all shouting stuff in Spanish at our building. They see me, start flipping me off and whatnot before they suddenly scatter in all directions. Then bam, a brick lands right in the spot where they were before they scattered. See, that's the type of guy Hector was. He could go out for a pack of rips and find himself in a brick fight with a bunch of Puerto Rican kids on the way back. Never in my life have I ever had a fight with a preteen, let alone one involving projectiles. But around Hector, that stuff was like a daily occurrence. So come that October, Hector is headed out on some big Halloween tour with one of his bands, and he tells me he won't be back till the second week of November. That meant I'd have to cover half of the rent until then, something I'd have to borrow money to do. This causes a big fight, and for the first time since I moved in, I thought Hector might actually hit me. And being the kind of guy that he was, I knew for a fact that if it came to violence, he wouldn't just stop at one punch. So when the time came for him to go on tour, the mood in the apartment isn't just at its low point. I'm legit scared for my physical safety. He leaves, I'm looking for a new apartment, and life is not so good anymore. So a few nights later, the night before Halloween actually, I'm sitting in the little kitchen area, eating arepas and looking for other apartments. Someone buzzes the apartment, so I go to see who it is. This is back when we had intercoms, but they sucked and barely worked half the time, so when I hear some guy with an accent says something like, "I need an apartment number 3, but the buzzer's not working," I just buzz the guy in without a second thought. New York is a city built on takeout, delivery, and street food, so I'm hardly going to be all suspicious over a delivery driver. But I should have been, and I almost paid with my life for it. Those guys busted our front door open like it was nothing, just smashed the lock right through with a sledgehammer. I actually thought it was the cops at first because they just piled in, guns drawn, shouting, "Get on the floor, get down." But then the way that they were talking to each other once I was lying face down on the linoleum, that clued me into the fact that they were just stick-up guys. But what were they doing in my apartment? My first thought was, Jesus Christ, Hector, whose toes did you step on now? But before I can wonder anymore, one of the guys starts asking me, "Where is it? Where is it?" I'm like, "Where's what?" But that just makes them mad. I get this flurry of kicks that have me balled up in the fetal position, then they ask me again. I can't tell them anything else, so I just say, I don't know what you're talking about. There's $20 in my wallet, that's all I got on me." The offer of $20 just offended them, and I get more kicks before they start tossing the apartment like they're looking for something. And when I say tossing, I really do mean trashing. They're deliberately breaking stuff, pulling drawers all the way out and then throwing them at other stuff. It was just destruction in every sense of the word, and it was around then that I got a look at a couple of the guys. They're all messed up or have stuff over their faces. They're wearing all black, gloves and the works. They were professional stick-up guys, probably robbed drug dealers for a living, but Hector wasn't dealing. I mean, I think I'd have noticed at some point. I saw a lot of broken guitars and amplifiers around the apartment, but not too many piles of coke or money. Then right as I'm about to think it, one of the guys comes out with it. "You sure this is the right place, man?" I don't know. Homie told me he keeps it behind the bathtub sometimes, but these people only got a shower in there." I feel this wave of relief washing over me. They got the wrong place, so they're gonna just walk out, right? Maybe take my phone so I can't call the cops. So, like I said, I told them my phone was on the table, next to my food, and that I wouldn't call the cops if they just left. Cuck move, maybe, but it's amazing how zen you get about material possessions when you see a Glock in someone's hand. The stick-up guys kind of pause and look at each other. Then right as I think they're about to just leave, one of them says, "I think you seen my face, man, when we were breaking in. He's gotta go." One of them has the gun, and the guy who wants me dead starts reaching to take it off the guy who has it, but the guy who has it doesn't want to give it up. That was my cue to soil myself and start begging for my life. It wasn't my proudest moment, and peeing my pants was by no means metaphorical, but it is what it is looking back. They're arguing over shooting me. I'm begging for my life. It's just chaos and them shouting in there, and I'm amazed no one had called the cops already. But then boom. The front entrance of the apartment building slams shut, and I can hear a very familiar voice coming up the stairs. I'm not even going to type out what Hector was saying. I'd be canceled and deleted from the internet within seconds after posting, but let's just say someone had canceled their tour 3 days in, and he was livid about it. Going on calling them every name under the sun, ranting and raving as he pounded his way up the stairs, and in the apartment, both me and the stick-up guys are about frozen in anticipation. Then right as Hector is about to come into the apartment, he says something like, "Hey, I got your money, you whiny little baby. What the The guy with the gun aims it at Hector as he walks in, looking around at the pure destruction that greeted him. "Who are you people?" he screamed. "Who are you?" the guy with the gun screamed back. Hector is just gone by this point, foaming at the mouth, looking like he's got one of his eyeballs about to pop when he comes back. "I live here!" Then, I swear to God, I watch as Hector basically turns into a drunk, slightly overweight Jason Bourne. He swings his backpack off his shoulder and just launches it at the shooter. He knocks the guy slightly off balance, messes up his aim, but by the time he can rearrange himself, Hector football tackles this guy onto the carpet and just starts wailing on him. The two other guys then jump in, and I'm thinking, oh Jesus God, someone's about to get shot. When out of nowhere, Hector comes up and is just windmailing punches at both guys, holding his own until he goes down again. Then almost immediately, both guys start backing up, hands in the air, and there's Hector, holding the gun he'd almost just been shot with, telling both the guys to back up. His face is bleeding. He's totally gassed, but there he is, having just won a freaking fistfight with 3 guys, one of them armed. He then sits on the KO'd shooter's back, tells the other guys to get out of his apartment, and tells me to dial 911. And only when the cops show up to arrest the guy he'd managed to detain did he realize he'd been stabbed in the shoulder. That night, as he got stitched up at the hospital, I sifted through all the broken and non-broken stuff, swept up all the broken glass and ceramics, and generally tried to put the apartment back in order. He got back at around 1 a.m., still drunk after the doctor told him, "Do not drink on these painkillers," and immediately started complaining about the break-in. I just carried on cleaning up, stopping only briefly to say something deeply heartfelt. "Hector, dude, I just wanted to say I think you might have saved my life today, dude, and I just wanted to say thank you." I felt my throat kind of tighten as I said it, very similar to the way it's doing now as I'm typing this, remembering. Hector looked up at me, with this look in his eyes that almost made it look like I'd gotten through to him, until he replied with, "Whatever, you could have jumped in at any time." I didn't mind. I knew Hector well enough by that point to know he wasn't exactly in touch with his feelings. But as he immediately sought to leave the room due to the uncomfortable amount of emotion in the air, he turned and said, "Did you see the look on those guys' faces, though? It's hilarious, dude." And he just walked off to his bedroom, laughing that evil toddler laugh that makes my skin crawl, even today. You see, for just over a year, I shared an apartment with the biggest idiot on the face of the earth. And I owe that idiot my life. Please, New York, don't ever change. This is less of a creepy one-person encounter and more of a whole community creeped out by one man. The neighbor in question is somewhat famous for his lawn, an impossibly thick green landscape that he had tended by a company. I'm vaguely aware of him losing it on the landscapers, screaming at them outside. Enough I knew he had a temper. The first real red flag that he might be legit crazy came last summer. He asked a teenage boy in the neighborhood to check in on the house once a day and make sure all the doors and windows were secured and water their flowers. The day they left, though, he left a crazy list, saying the kid had to be there multiple times a day, turning off and on different sets of lights at specific times, and leaving weird chores for him. Also, the kid was not allowed to walk on the lawn, and he had to remove his dirty shoes before walking on the concrete sidewalk. He was never to enter the house, but was to turn off and on the lights from the doorway by means of a stick with a loop on it. Also, he was not allowed to use the garden hose to water the lawn, and had to instead use a teeny tiny watering can. The letter implied that my neighbor would have the kid under surveillance and would have pictures if he failed to comply. Basically, the kid's parents called him and said they weren't comfortable with the situation anymore, and while they would keep an eye on the house, the deal was off. They argued over the phone. When my neighbor got back from vacation, it was early morning, and he immediately went to their house, woke them, and tried to pick a fight with them. One of the other neighbors is a retired colonel and came out to see what was going on and tried to settle the issue. Crazy neighbor said that he would let it rest if he was allowed to bare-ass spank the kid. He flipped out when they told him hell no. Sometime after this, another neighbor was at the grocery store when he was concerned by Crazy Neighbor. Crazy Neighbor apparently just talked at him in rapid fire for a half hour. Among other things, he started saying how wives shouldn't have friends, and said that his wife's sister was so fat she broke the toilet seat last time she visited. After this, everyone started talking about how you don't see his wife anywhere. Occasionally she will be out watering flowers, but while her husband is seen out, she isn't. Considering that she used to be a social butterfly, this is weird. During the winter, everyone found pamphlets on their mailbox from the landscaper he uses, along with a note saying it was mandatory to now use this landscaper in our area, and failure to comply will result in being sued. We are private, single-family homes with no homeowners association, so this is patently untrue. During the winter, someone saw his wife and her arm was in a sling and she had a black eye. When they went to ask her about it, he wouldn't let her speak and said she had slid on ice. Since then, there have been a few attempts made to talk to her alone, and all have failed. They've gone so far as to get their church involved and to call a welfare check by the cops when he was out of the house. But if she is being abused, she has been refusing help. Snow was bad this year, and he blew a fit about the snowplows piling snow on his property. So he scattered screws on the roadway outside before they came one morning. Then someone in the neighborhood got a puppy. It's quiet and has a fenced-in backyard. Its owners wake up in the middle of the night to the doorbell ringing. When they come out, Crazy Neighbor is standing on the road at the edge of the property. He tells them that the first time the dog gets out, they won't have a dog anymore, and he pulls out a gun and waves it around before pointing it towards the backyard and saying, "Bang." Obviously, they go back inside and call the cops. When confronted, Crazy Neighbor claims he was out for a walk, thought they were awake and stopped by. He says he didn't get the gun out, but it had been on his belt, and that he didn't mean his statement as a threat. He ended up getting some sort of citation from the police. Come spring, He has taken to sitting outside and writing something every time someone walks or drives by. We don't know what, but I have taken to driving differently home to avoid going by him. Most recently, someone put up a swing set in their backyard. They came back from work to find tire tracks through the backyard and the swing set run over and crushed. No one saw anything, but his massive truck happens to have the same kind of tires as the tread arcs left behind. The retired colonel has taken to compiling statements from everyone and keeping records, because we think this is going to end badly. I'm an uninteresting man in my late 20s with a stable job and happy family. Being so, I had never even entertained the thought that I might, one day, be the target of a stalker. So here's my story as a warning to everyone. You don't have to be a typical, pretty young lady to catch the eye of a stalker. I don't know if this makes sense, but I am a habitual yet very casual Facebook user. I don't post a lot, but I do check my news feed often. One Saturday night I was doing a quick round on Facebook before I went to bed when I received a friend request. I accepted it without hesitation. Just about every friend request I receive gets accepted because I don't ever post anything very personal. As I said, I have a very casual approach to social networking. I do a quick glance on the profile that had friended me and saw that it was an obviously fake account. Not thinking much of it, I put my computer away and fell asleep. The next day, I was having lunch at a friend's house, having completely forgotten about the friend request from the night before. My phone buzzed and I saw that I had gotten a message from a coworker of mine, Maya. Although Maya and I worked together and had a few mutual friends outside of work, we didn't communicate much other than when it was about work. I checked it, assuming it was work-related. I guess looking back, you can say it was. To get the gist of it, the Facebook account that friended me also friended Maya and had bombarded her with insults and accusations of being a whore, slut, and every name in the book. The person took it a step further by messaging Maya's husband, saying that she was cheating on him with a coworker. Maya wanted to know if I knew who the person was, because I was the only other person that accepted the friend request. I explained to her how I accept every request and have no idea who it was. I then proceeded to unfriend the profile in question. Maya explained to me that she already had suspicions on who it was, but just wanted to see if I could confirm it. She believed it was Carrie. Let's rewind to a few weeks earlier. I had received a friend request from Carrie. It struck me as odd because, although we worked at the same place, we had never met, never spoken, nor had we ever made eye contact or been within 20 feet of each other. We worked in different departments, but I walked past her every day because I had to walk through her department to get to our lounge. That was the furthest extent of our interactions. I only learned her name from when she friended me on Facebook and I recognized her picture. I'm not sure how she found out my name. Carrie also friended my wife's profile and subsequently began to sift through years of my wife's posts and pictures, liking and commenting on several of them. She began interacting with my posts too, as though she knew us as well. At work though, I'd walk by like usual and still no interaction. I found it odd, but didn't look too far into it. So back to the present, the mysterious Facebook account continued to harass Maya until she told her that she knew it was Carrie and was going to call the police. I thought that was the end of that, but boy, was I wrong. Over several weeks, I began getting more friend requests from girls looking to hook up with me. Obviously, I knew they were all fake, and for the most part, I ignored them. I also began getting notifications from Google and Facebook accounts about suspicious activity on my profile. Most of the time, it warned me of failed login attempts. One I specifically remember said my Facebook account was actually logged in from somewhere unusual and asked whether it was me. It wasn't me, and I should have been more concerned, but for some reason I didn't care at the time. I was stupid, and even after that, I didn't bother to change my password. At the time, I viewed all of these happenings as random, isolated incidents. I had no valuable stuff on my account and didn't have any private secretive messages. What harm could they do, right? A few months pass when one day my wife gets a message from Carrie stating that she had bought a high-end video camera and was looking to start some amateur filming. She wanted to know if we could help her by letting her film our family for a day. Remembering what Maya had said a few months ago, I was reluctant but wanted to give Carrie the benefit of the doubt, so we agreed to tell her that we'd schedule a time for her whenever we weren't busy and left it at that. Once again, I have yet to actually meet Carrie. More weeks pass by and we completely forget about scheduling the film shoot when Carrie messages me about it. I turn her down. Then things got weird. She sent several GIF files of stick figures doing sexually suggestive motions and gyrations. I didn't respond, so she asked, "Funny, isn't it?" I immediately texted my wife to log into my Facebook profile to observe the messages. Not wanting to be rude, I agreed with Carrie as of the humor in the GIFs she sent and carried on the conversation. She proceeded to send me old photos from my abandoned MySpace account that I had completely forgotten about. That was around the time when MySpace had been revamped and people lost a lot of cherished memories. Somehow she dug mine up and decided to share them with me. It was creepy to me. Things escalated quickly from there. She began talking about her body and how she wasn't attractive, trying to bait me into complimenting her looks. She was not beautiful, but she was an attractive person. I didn't bite though. Then she hit me with something out of the blue. She asked me about my penis, calling it my cock and suggesting that it was probably pretty big. I decided that was enough and stopped responding. Of course, my wife was reading the whole time and we were texting back and forth about how funny and weird this all was. I continued to go to work and still awkwardly never actually met Carrie. I especially didn't want to strike up any conversations after that. Carrie messaged me one final time asking for a favor. Maya had blocked her profile and Carrie suspected that Maya was saying bad stuff about her, so she wanted me to check her profile to confirm. I told her that I wasn't going to stalk Maya for her and that was that. Just between us though, I did check and no, Maya couldn't care less to waste her time talking about Carrie. Around this time, my wife got a text from an unknown number. The person knew her name but was trying to remain anonymous and was trying to flirt with her. We were with a bunch of friends at the time and we all thought it'd be funny if we all text flirted with this person at the same time to annoy them. Once again, I never thought to connect any of the incidents. Carrie eventually quit work, and I never saw her again, but I continued to get suspicious activity and friend requests that I, stupidly, continued to write off. I had all but forgotten about Carrie. Then, I'd say over a year later, I get a bomb from my wife. A good friend of ours texted her that I was sending her very inappropriate messages on Facebook. I had been busy running errands all day and hadn't really checked my Facebook at the time. I found that my password had been changed when I finally logged back on. All of my messages had also been cleared. I had no idea the extent of what happened until I started hearing from people that I was being very suggestive and nasty to them. The thing was, these weren't random women on my friends list that were targeted. These were women that were close to me, good friends, my wife's sisters, my friends' wives. These messages weren't holding back either. They went all out in graphic detail about what I wanted to do to them. I felt completely violated and humiliated. I couldn't imagine how the women felt. My wife and I were really close to our families and friends, and every other week or so, all of our friends would get together and drink, BBQ, watch movies or sports and hang out. We'd seen several families over and never had a problem. All of them said they understood what happened and that they know it wasn't me. Deep inside though, I could see that they felt that it possibly, potentially, probably was me. Over time, More and more of them stopped coming over to the point where my home started to feel empty. I confided in my wife how I felt that they think it was me, and she rebutted that I was just being paranoid. She argued that our friends were just busy with their lives, that they'd eventually come over when they were free again. I then learned that someone had created a Facebook account using my name and picture and had continued harassing the same women. One of them posted a picture of the conversation with this false me on Facebook. She commented that it could really be me because that mystery person has used some words that I typically would. She also stated that the person knew my friends and family extensively. My heart instantly shattered reading that. I quit checking my Facebook for the longest time, and I guess I fell into a mild depression. I felt miserable. I told my wife that I wanted to disappear and strongly considered quitting my job of 7 years and moving away to start anew. I now know that I was being quite irrational, and thankfully my wife stayed strong for me through it all. I felt like I needed to defend my honor and started gathering alibis of times, people, and places I was around during the time of many of those messages. My wife brutally told me that she couldn't believe I was weak enough to let a no-life dumbass on Facebook put me down and make me feel that way. Which is true. I am and always have been a very mentally strong person. I always look for the best in a bad situation, but for some reason this affected me differently. I can't explain why, but I felt extreme shame and guilt for something I didn't even do. Without my wife's support knocking me back to reality, I don't know what would have happened. We advised our friends just to ignore the person, and eventually everything stopped. From time to time I still get a random friend request, but I don't accept them anymore. I don't have any proof that this was all the work of Carrie. It just all happened during a time when she injected herself into my life and eventually stopped after she left. My friends have started coming over again, but it hasn't felt the same ever since then. I don't know if it's them or just in my head. My wife and I came to the conclusion that Carrie reveled in the misery of others. After tormenting Maya, she moved on and targeted me, trying to ruin my marriage and distance me from friends for no other reason than the fact that she enjoyed doing so. I'm sure she hasn't stopped and only left me alone because she found a new victim to harass.
This happened to me and my wife back in the summer of 2017. We had actually only gotten married a few months prior, and obviously because of the wedding costs, our financial situation wasn't the best. And this made it so that we could only afford a place to live that was super cheap and that would let us pay week to week. But luckily, we were able to find just that in the form of a boarding house in our city. The house was 3 stories and had 4 rooms, with a shared kitchen and a bathroom for everyone. We moved into one of the rooms on the 2nd floor. Now, obviously with it being a boarding house, we had to share with a few other people. The most noteworthy ones being a young couple named Jim and Jennifer just above us in a room on the 3rd floor. And in the 3 months we lived there, they were the only neighbors we talked to. They seemed similar to us in both age and interests, but we usually just talked to them in passing, or even sometimes on the front porch, where we were all out having a cigarette. Though, after a few weeks, we would quickly realize that they didn't get along too well. It started off with small things, like hearing them yell at each other for short durations of time, or hearing one of them angrily leave the house in some absurd hour of the night. But the short fights didn't last long. They would get only longer and louder as time went on. Though, that was until one day. My wife and I were watching a movie, and the whole time the usual fights were taking place just above us. But right as the movie ended, we both noticed they abruptly stopped. Don't get me wrong, it was nice to finally have peace and quiet, but it was completely out of character for them. I mean, this never happened. They would almost never just abruptly stop yelling at each other, especially at this point in the night. Though, even still, we both agreed that we should take advantage of the silence and try to go to sleep. And luckily we were able to. But just for me to be woken up in the middle of the night by my wife, who was shaking me and looking off toward the side of our bed, I was tired and completely out of it. I didn't know what time it was, or why I was being woken up. Out of habit, I turned over to get up. But when I did, I could make out a man standing right next to our bed, hunched over my nightstand going through the drawer. I was in absolute disbelief. After locking eyes, he stood up from his hunch position and proceeded to just stare at me. I sat up on my bed, and the guy started backing up slowly. I honestly didn't know if what I was seeing was real or just my imagination. But after turning on our room's lamp, I realized it was our upstairs neighbor Jim, the same one who was always yelling and keeping us up late. I was a little relieved, but still, why was he going through our stuff while we were sleeping? It was completely out of character for him. After calming down for a second, I said, "Well, what's up, Jim? What are you doing in our room, man?" After a few seconds of silence, Jim responded by asking if he could borrow our car, or if we could take him somewhere. My wife, who was now fully awake, screamed at him no, not after he broke into her room at 3 in the morning. She told him that if he didn't leave, she was going to call the cops. And Jim responded to this by full-on sprinting out of the room. But not just the room, the dude full-on ran out the front door and down the street in a seemingly random direction. I looked at my wife, and we both agreed that something was clearly off about the whole situation. We figured at this point we had to go upstairs and check on Jim's wife Jennifer. And so we do. We go upstairs, and the first thing we notice is the door to the room was shut, but it wasn't locked. I told my wife we should probably just leave her alone, but she insisted against it, so I reluctantly knocked and shouted the usual hello. After no response, we slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. What we saw next was straight out of a horror movie. The room looked terrible, as if someone had just gone crazy hitting random areas with an axe. That's when we noticed Jennifer lying on the floor face down. We walked over to her, thinking that Jim had knocked her unconscious. But as we got closer, we realized there was fresh blood staining the carpet underneath her. In complete horror, we called the cops immediately. We explained to them that we believed we had just walked into a murder scene, but that the murderer himself had already left. The police would tell us to leave the room and wait outside until they arrived. And sure enough, they would arrive not even 5 minutes later. After explaining everything that happened that night, the cops set out a search for Jim. And luckily, they were able to find him around an hour later, still running down the street. After further talking with the cops, they said it looked like Jim was trying to find a gas station so that he could get fuel to help him burn the whole house down, with the goal of burning Jennifer's dead body inside. This in turn would remove all evidence connecting him to the murder, though Jim would ultimately be convicted with the murder of his own wife. For the next couple of days, both me and my wife couldn't leave the house, as every time we tried, we would be swarmed by different news reporters asking us for an interview. Me and my wife would of course move out as soon as we found the funds to do so, but still, the whole thing was insanely terrifying. I mean, in the middle of the night, we had unknowingly come face to face with a man who had just murdered his own wife, and who was ultimately planning to murder us in the process of destroying the evidence.
A few years ago, I came home from work to find my girlfriend sitting on the couch with a glum look on her face. When I asked her what the matter was, she gave me that fateful line, "We need to talk." She told me she wasn't happy in our relationship anymore and that she thought that we should take a break to see other people, essentially so we could decide if we really were supposed to be together. I really didn't want to, but I loved her enough to respect her decision and I agreed. I thought if I at least gave her idea a try, I'd eventually win her back, but a few weeks later our relationship was well and truly over, and I had to move out of the apartment that we shared. Since it was technically her apartment first, obviously I had to find a new place to live, and fast. So I definitely didn't take all the time I should have to find somewhere decent, and I ended up paying for it pretty badly. The place I ended up renting was a one-room studio apartment in a building that straight up looked like a haunted house. I mean, that probably should have been a warning right there, but it was cheap, available, and the landlord only wanted a month's rent in advance to exchange for the keys. Plus, there was absolutely no way I was about to move back in with my mom and dad. Like, they'd be nice enough to offer, but It would have felt like way too much like a step back, and so I opted for the studio. Moving in was easy enough. I didn't have all that much in the way of possessions to take with me, and honestly, I just couldn't be bothered arguing with my then ex-girlfriend about who was entitled to what. The whole thing had been unpleasant enough without souring the broken relationship even further with petty arguments over furniture. Besides, as long as I had my Xbox and my 4K telly, I'd be happy enough. So the day after I move in, I knock at the flat across the hall from me to introduce myself to my neighbor. There was this thumping bass beat coming from the other side, so I knew someone was home, but when they answered, I was pretty shocked at how frank and unfriendly they were. The guy was quite young, with thick dark beard and a Cockney accent, and he didn't open the door the whole way. He just opened like a little crack before peering out. I introduced myself, told him I moved in across the hallway from him, and added that if he ever needed to borrow a cup of sugar or anything, he knew where to find me. But all I got in return was this cold, nervous stare. I figured I might have interrupted him in something, so I apologized and added that my name was Ollie. He replied, telling me his name was Jack. I know this sounds mad, but I got the distinct impression it was a name that he just plucked out of the air. Just something in my gut told me that, as weird as this sounds, and that he just made it up on the spot. But I'm not really the paranoid type, so I just put it down to him being a generally awkward person or whatever before I disappeared back into my flat. A few weeks later, I was just leaving my flat to head off to work when I saw a guy leaving Jack's flat. I wished him a good morning, and he wished me the same, and I followed up by asking him if he was one of Jack's friends or his flatmate or something. "Who?" he replies. It was then that I smelled the alcohol in his breath. I repeated the question, pointing towards the door of the flat and reiterating that it was Jack's flat. Yeah, I'm Jack's mate," he said, before continuing down the stairs and out the front door. Now this one I definitely knew was a lie, and it was that which clued me into the fact that the original guy had been lying to me too. Something weird was going on with that flat, but just exactly what it was I couldn't possibly imagine at that stage. So this keeps happening for about a fortnight longer, with me catching different people going in and out of the flat across the hallway at all hours of the night. So when the landlord calls to pick up the next month's rent, I bring up the tenants from across the hall and ask him exactly who it is that lives there. He racks his brain for a moment, finally coming up with the name Stephen as the name of the tenant, adding that he's the best tenant he's ever had, how there are no noise complaints, how he always pays the rent on time and on the first day of every month via a direct debit deposit into his bank account. I was on the verge of telling him all about the different people I'd seen, but it wasn't really any of my business, was it? I mean, yeah, it was probably something a bit dodgy going on over there, but as long as no one was getting hurt, what did it have to do with me? I'm not a grass, so I've never been. It's just not my nature, so I kept my gob shut, even though in time I'd really, really wish that I hadn't. About a week later, I was asleep in bed when something woke me up, a sound coming from outside my flat. It was of heavy footfalls on the stairs, and somehow I knew it was something to do with the flat across the hall. As I lay there all blurry-eyed, I finally decided that I was going to put a complaint into the landlord, but was nearly scared out of my skin when I heard a series of loud bangs on the front of my flat. "Merseyside Police! Open the door, or we smash it in!" My heart began to race, so hard that I could actually hear it pumping in my ears. I was frozen to the spot for a moment, and it took another few bangs and another shock before I could even get my head together. I ran to the threshold, pulling back the mortise lock before opening up the door. The next thing I know, there's a torch in my face, completely blinding me as a pair of armed, tactically dressed policemen storm into my flat and throw me to the ground. "Hands behind your back! Move and you're getting shot," one screamed, not even waiting for me to obey him as he pulled my hands into the small of my back and placed them in cuffs. "Get the bloody light on, Reg," he said to the other policeman, pulling me up onto my knees and telling me to stay put. So I'm up on my knees, facing the door of my flat, with the other officer keeping his back against the door, drawing it open. I can see that there is another pair of police officers who have been banging on the door of the flat across the hall, only there's no reply from inside. No one comes to open the door. So up comes this other policeman with one of those door basher things. I don't know the proper name, only that one of the police called it the big key. They smashed their way into the door, screaming as they went. I figured they'd start dragging out whoever was in there, or at least being as aggressive as they were with me. But bizarrely, it was almost the opposite tone. It was verging on kind and caring, and I listened in confusion as they asked the person, "Are you all right? Do you know where you are? Can you hear me?" It was a minute or so later I watched in absolute horror as one officer walked out of the flat carrying a girl who couldn't have been any older than a teenager. She was barely dressed, covered in bruises, and her hair was a greasy mess that was plastered to her scalp. I looked up at one of the officers, a look of pure shock and revulsion on my face. "Let me guess, you didn't know anything about it. Why don't you just save it for the interview?" he says. But I didn't. I swear to God I didn't. And I told the police who questioned me down at the station the exact thing when they asked me all sorts of things about human trafficking rings. I broke down in tears when they tried to get me to admit that I was the ringleader or something, and swore blind that I had no idea what they were talking about, and that I'd never do anything like that, and that I just didn't have it in me. Eventually, they let me go, satisfied that I didn't have anything to do with it, but I was horrified that something like that couldn't have been going on right under my nose, that I'd smiled and joked with some of the scumbags that I'd frequented that flat, completely unaware of the hellishly cruel things they'd been getting up to inside of it. I ended up moving back in with my mom and dad not long after. I just couldn't live in that place anymore, and I couldn't cope with looking for a new place, not with the intense paranoia of not knowing what was going on behind the closed doors all around me. So please, as much as it might go against all of your F the police mentalities, just call the police if you think something weird is happening like that near you, because it is our business. It's all of our business, and that decision might be the difference between someone's freedom and an existence of pure torture.
When I was as young as 14, I started working at various gas stations in my town. My town was small. Everyone knew pretty much everyone, so the owners wouldn't care if I came in and helped out with stuff like mopping the floors, stocking the coolers, or even running the register at times, all for a small amount of cash. This all took place back in the early 90s in Florida. It was maybe 11 p.m. at night, and I was sitting at my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows of the gas station. I would generally spend most of the nights at that table reading books and periodically getting up to do different chores. Now, being only 14, I obviously wasn't allowed to be the only one running the store at any given time. It would usually be me and a manager, or maybe another employee or two. This night, it was me and a guy named Jeff. Jeff was one of the part-time managers, and usually when it was only me and him, he would spend most of his time in the back, which basically left me to hold down the store by myself. This night was no different. I remember sitting at the register when I glanced up. Something had caught my attention that was especially odd. I could see a lady who was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. Like, there were literally no customer cars in the parking lot. Now, this in itself was weird, as because of where we were located, we would get almost nobody that would walk here, especially not from the direction of the interstate. I mean, the store was practically in the middle of nowhere along a very desolate interstate. Nobody just walks this road. I figured she must have broken down somewhere and was coming up to fill a gas container or use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. After around a minute of me watching her, I realized she didn't have a container in her hands. She then came into the store and looked around for a few minutes. The whole situation just felt off. I remember getting a strange and disturbing vibe from her, just from the way she was looking around the store. By this point, Jeff had come out from the back and was standing behind the register with me. He would occasionally do this when customers came in. The lady then walked up to the counter and started telling us a story about how her car had broken down and that she needed a ride to some town I had never heard of before. Jeff promptly responded, saying that he was working and that there was no way he could take her, as he was the manager and couldn't leave me here alone. That's when the lady turned to look at me, as if to get my response. Before saying anything, I looked back at Jeff, who looked at me with a very cold and hard stare, subtly shaking his head as if to say no. And that was my assurance that I knew that he knew something was off about this lady. Now, before I could respond, she turned back to Jeff and pointed at me, asking if I could take her. Jeff quickly and sternly responded that I was too young to drive and said there was no way we could help her. I obviously didn't argue with Jeff about his response on my behalf, as to be quite honest, this was completely out of character for him. Jeff was normally friendly and even chatty with the customers, and this further supported the fact that Jeff knew something was off about this lady. The lady, now clearly infuriated, cussed us out and left. As she walked back down the parking lot, I kept an eye on her. I noticed she had stopped at the end of the parking lot, right next to the interstate itself. I also noticed she was now on a phone call and waited for maybe 2 minutes when a car pulled up, stopped right next to her, and let her in as if the car was expecting her. The whole situation was weird, yeah, but I never truly realized how much danger I was actually in that night until a while later. Almost a year passed. It was night, and I was in my bedroom falling asleep as the TV was on in the background. I don't know what channel it was on, possibly some news channel or something, but regardless, something I heard on the TV snapped me wide awake. I sat up to look at the TV, and was greeted with the mugshot of a lady on the screen. As soon as I saw her, I immediately knew. That was the same lady that I had been in the store with almost a year prior, and who tried to lure either me or my manager to drive her into town. I was 100% sure that was the same woman. It turns out the lady was Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer with a confirmed 7 victims who were all men. Eileen would lure her victims out into the middle of nowhere, and that's where she would shoot them at point-blank range. What disturbs me most is how close I was to becoming one of those victims myself. From both the way she acted in the store and what I now know about her, I firmly believe her plans were to kill either me or my manager Jeff that night. To this day, I still have nightmares about what would have happened had we done what she said.
I'm a female who used to work at Chick-fil-A when I was in my late teens and early 20s. Overall, it was a fun place to work and I made lots of friends. Everyone who worked there was super nice, which is why I stayed working there for so long. However, at one point, we hired a new guy named Justin. From the day he started working there, Justin just seemed like a jerk. He was rude and selfish and would do things like go on his phone during shifts, take really long bathroom breaks, and leave early. I found out he was a relative to one of our managers, and as a favor to his family, she was able to get him a job. He was a somewhat troubled guy who had gotten into some problems before, but it was thought that the job would help him out. For the first few weeks, though, it didn't. For the most part, when I first met him, though, he was rather nice to me. Shortly after that, he asked me out during a shift, though. He basically asked what I was doing and if I wanted to hang out or go someplace with him. I really didn't want to and told him that I was busy. Over the next few times that we worked together, he remained persistent and would ask me to hang out after work or something like that almost every time. When I would say no or come up with excuses, he would seem to grow increasingly angry. I also heard from another female worker that he had been doing the same to her. He was a bigger guy, almost looked like a football player as he was over 6 feet tall with very short hair and strong looking. One night, he asked me to hang out after work because he saw me clocking out for my lunch break. I told him no again, but this time he grabbed my arm. He asked me why in a very serious and frustrated tone. I told him I was sorry, but I just really didn't want to. The way he aggressively grabbed me made me kind of worried, and I decided in that moment I would have to talk to my boss because I had really had enough of him. The rest of my shift was really busy, and as it was time for dinner, we had a big rush. I didn't get a chance to speak with my boss, Christine, and I even forgot about the situation. Finally, after things quieted down and we were no longer busy, my shift was over and it was time for me to go home. I clocked out and then got my coat and headed for my car. As I approached my car, I suddenly saw somebody jump out from behind it. Where I was parked, it was at the back side of the restaurant that was bordering a grassy area with a couple of trees. I saw the person who had jumped out was Justin. I was really surprised to see him. He said to me that I had no reason to dislike him and asked me what my problem was. I told him I really didn't have a problem with him, I just wanted to go home. He was standing blocking my driver's door, and I knew it would be hard for me to get around him. I asked him if he should get back to work. He then told me that he was off and he had been off for 2 hours just waiting for me. Obviously, this creeped me out even more. He then stepped towards me and grabbed my arm again. When he did, he shoved me in the opposite direction. There was a car parked 2 spaces away, and I guess it was his because I heard it unlock. He then shoved me to the car and told me to get inside. I asked him why. He said he just wanted to talk. When he said this, his voice seemed to lighten up. I figured maybe I could have an actual conversation with him and let him know he needed to leave me alone and these things are not okay. I reluctantly got inside the car. Justin shut the door and then walked around and got inside to the driver's seat. But instead of talking to me, he immediately started up the car and began backing out. He also locked all of the doors in the process. Right away, I got a terrible feeling. I asked him what he was doing. He said to shut up and then cursed at me. He then went on a short rant about how he hated working and how he had just quit. As he did this, the car started to speed up and he merged onto a busier road. I knew I was in trouble and took out my phone from my pocket and immediately went to dial 911. Justin saw me doing this, and I was just barely able to hit call on my phone. I could hear the ringing on the other end, but no more than a couple of seconds of this, and Justin reached over and grabbed my phone. He yelled at me and we wrestled over the phone for a couple of seconds. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to pull it away from him fast enough. He got control of my phone and then rolled down his window and tossed the phone out onto the side of the road. He then kept on driving. I was terrified. I knew that I could no longer call for help and decided that I had to try to think of something to do. Justin just kept on driving down the road at a really fast speed. None of us said a word for several minutes. I was just doing my best to think about what I could possibly do to try to escape. Then, suddenly I saw the amazing sight of flashing lights behind us. Justin started yelling and cursing, and eventually he pulled over. The police pulled over with him, and as soon as the car stopped, Justin opened his door and took off into the woods. I saw the police officer run after him, and I got out of the car. The officer told me to stay put, and then he called for backup. Eventually, more officers arrived, and a short time later, I heard that they had caught Justin after a foot chase. The police told me they had received a 911 call from my phone, and even though I didn't talk to anyone, they decided to investigate the area the call was made from. They only originally pulled over Justin because he was speeding, but after he took off running, they went after him. I was so grateful that I was all right and got out of that situation. After that, I took some time off of work and eventually returned to work there for a short time more.
This happened on June 7th, 2013, when I was a freshman in college. It was a regular day where I had 3 classes. I finished one class and had an hour between one class and the beginning of another. I always went to our campus library. But on my way to the library, I received a call from my brother. He told me that he saw a man shooting at a bus in the middle of the street. I expressed to him how crazy I thought that was. He also told me that the car sped away. He doesn't know where they went. I got to the library and I told him that I would call him back. As I was sitting in the library with my head in the book, I happened to see a random car park in the middle of our campus and 2 people got out. 1 man and 1 woman. The woman was running frantically and the man got out wearing all black with what looks like a rifle in his hand. I then thought back to what my brother just told me, thinking that this might be the same person. At the same time, I thought to myself, why is this police officer getting out of that random car? He was dressed just like a SWAT officer, sort of. I sat there trying to figure out what was going on as this man walked across the courtyard. Then all of a sudden, he walked up to this woman, who I knew from one of my classes, and without hesitation, he shot her and continued to walk toward our building. I began to yell out to everyone that he has a gun, and I was pointing outside. I saw a few people react when I did, due to the sound of the gunshot. They began to yell also. It all happened so fast and a lot of us began to hide because we couldn't get out. Some people got out, but we didn't have time to. I hid in an aisle. I saw the man enter through the automatic doors with his rifle to his side. He was yelling out that he was a police officer, but he didn't hold his weapon like one. But once he said that a few students came out from hiding, he grabbed his weapon and they ran, but he didn't shoot. I peeked my head out more as the man walked to the front desk. I could see the librarian peek her head around, but she looked confused. The man saw her as he were walking past the desk. He stopped, and he looked to where she was, but she just so happened to move away. She actually walked away instead of run for some reason. He walked through the doors into a hallway where she went into. I came out from hiding and placed myself where I could see the hallway all the way down the hallway. He followed the librarian. She went into a closet with other people, and the shooter started to bang on the door, but he kept saying that he was the police. He told them to open within a few minutes, or he'll shoot. But within a few seconds, he began to fire into the door. I heard people screaming and I wanted to help, but I felt that would be suicide for me, being that I didn't have a weapon. I heard people saying that the police are coming. The man stopped shooting and started to bang on the door even more. He then left that door, heading back toward us. I went back into hiding, but could still see. He walked through the room where we were, and he went out into the first set of doors, and the cops were right there. The cops and the shooter began to fire at the same time, and then it all stopped. The cops dragged the man outside and escorted all of us outside. Out there, it was pretty chaotic. Eventually, we found out who the shooter was. His name was John Sawari. He went on a shooting spree within our city that day. This happened in 2013, but it still feels like it just happened yesterday. It was Halloween of 2012, and I was closing at work, which is Chick-fil-A. We were a new establishment in the area that we're in, and the neighborhood was pretty bad. In and out all afternoon and evening, I saw hundreds of people dressed in their costumes. All of the cliche costumes, Jason, Freddy Krueger, and Michael Myers. At around 7:30, there was a long line inside, and out of nowhere there was some commotion. My manager came out to break it up. When he broke it up, some guy in the Ghostface costume from Scream ran out of the door. That person that ran out of the door got into it with a woman that was dressed as Meg from Family Guy. At least that's what I thought she was, until she told us that she wasn't in costume. She was just ugly. Anyway, this woman told our manager and the cops that some person in a Ghostface costume tried to lure her 7-year-old daughter out of the building to his car. The little girl was running back and forth between her mother, who was in line, and the play area inside. I guess the man in the Scream costume told the girl that her mom told her to wait in his car, and he grabbed her. The mom turned around and saw it. Then she started to yell and scream. A few hours later, we locked the doors, and then some guy knocked at our drive-through window. He had on a Ghostface costume from the movie Scream, but I don't know if it was the same guy from earlier. I yelled out that we're closed, and this guy tries to bust through the drive-through window. I screamed, and the manager ran out, and then that man ran to our front door banging. Then he stopped and just stared at us. At that point, it was just my manager and I. My manager called the cops, and the man left and popped his trunk of his car. He grabbed something out of his trunk and put it under his costume. He then walked back up to the front door. He stared for another 30 seconds and pulled out a gun from under his costume, aimed it and pulled the trigger. We both ducked and screamed, but nothing happened. We looked up and he was fumbling with his gun. He was loading, unloading, and reloading. It had jammed. Then the cops showed up with their guns drawn. He got on the ground and they arrested this guy. We found out that this was a dangerous guy and he had a huge rap sheet, and we were pretty lucky that nothing happened to us that night. It may be cowardly, but I quit that job soon after that happened because of the neighborhood that Chick-fil-A was in. It happened on the day after Christmas in the year 2000. I worked at Edgewater Technology in Wakefield, Massachusetts. The day started off pretty normal. I clocked in and went to my station. We all did. I can remember that the aura of the day was off, but I might just be saying that due to what happened that day. After working for a little bit, I had to run to the bathroom due to my Christmas food from the day before. TMI, I know. I was reading a magazine, using the restroom, and out of nowhere, I heard people yelling and running and saying that he has a gun. Then I heard the rounds go off. It scared the crap out of me, literally. I got up without wiping. Then I heard more shots, but they were closer than before. A few people burst through the bathroom door, and they were saying that he's right there. They closed the door and they put the trash can in front of the door while pushing against it. They were also saying that Mike has gone crazy. We heard someone stop right by the door, but he was pleading, and then we heard another shot. But he was still making noises, then another shot, and then we didn't hear him anymore. Then it got silent. He was right in front of our door. We heard a gun get cocked and someone touching the door handle, but he stopped. There was no more shooting, but we could hear screaming and the fire alarm going off. Everyone in the bathroom was crying, and it got worse when the blood was coming in the bathroom from under the door from the person that was laying there. About a minute later, we heard police in the hallway, and they were in front of our door, but we were still afraid until we heard them assess the person that was bleeding by our door. They said he was gone. They opened the door and told us it's okay. They got him. The shooter was waiting for the cops in our reception area. His name was Michael Morgan McDermott. He actually worked with us. I don't know why he did what he did, but I can say that it was the worst day of my life. But what I won't forget is the scene once we left the bathroom. So many people were hurt, and the looks on the faces of those who got in his way will never leave my memory. What really confuses me is that I saw Michael right before this happened, and he was joking around with everyone. This situation really made me not be so quick to trust individuals, no matter how long I've known them. This is the worst day of my life.
The scariest thing that ever happened to me on Halloween was back when I was living in Liverpool for university. Halloween is always a big night for students, as is any yearly event that involves dressing up and getting absolutely wasted. But since Halloween is a really good excuse to wear considerably less clothes than usual, party-oriented students tend to get particularly excited about it. So I'm in second year at this point, living with a bunch of my student mates just off Smithton Road, which is where loads of students can get shared houses for really cheap rent. We heard that this big house party was happening just down the road from us, one of those that had its own little Facebook events page set up to keep track of invites and give people directions to the house. I remember my mates sitting around the kitchen table, all staring at the screen as they went through all the profiles of girls they said that were attending. I mean, some of them were absolutely gorgeous, so we were all definitely hyped about it. Only just a few days before Halloween, I started to feel really, really grim. I had the shakes. I was running to and from the toilet every half an hour to erupt from both ends, and I could barely keep any food down. This persisted for like 48 hours straight, and thankfully it had abated by Halloween itself, but I still felt way too rough to do any serious partying. The last thing I wanted was to end up browning myself in front of like half the girls at our uni. I mean, every lad wants to be a legend, don't they? But for the right reasons. So anyway, on the day of the house party, despite my mates insisting I make an appearance and throw together a costume, I had made the firm decision to stay at home and chill for the evening. As much as I felt like I'm missing out, I just didn't feel up to it. So about 7-ish, my mates are pre-drinking in the kitchen, while I'm up in my room looking to order the spiciest curry I could get my hands on, in the hopes that it would purge the rest of the sickness out of me, so I could start the following week feeling fresh again. So about the time I'm burning my face off with a little chicken vindaloo, my mates are just about to head off down to the house party for a night of debauchery. There are a few final pleas for me to join them, but these are all violently rebuked. There might have been a chance of me joining them before the curry, but afterwards, no chance. I was in a full-on food coma. So a couple of hours later, I'm just chilling on the couch and wondering why British Netflix had such a dire collection of horror films when there's a knock at our front door. My first thought is that there's been some kind of puke-related disaster and one of the lads had to come back to get a change of clothes before heading back to the house party. I mean, this wasn't entirely out of the question, since the house party was only around the corner, safe staggering distance for anyone that had drank too much too quickly. But it then occurred to me that there was a chance it could have been trick-or-treaters. Smithton has a big mix of residential and student housing, so there's also a decent chance it could have been kids looking for sweets. So to save the house getting egged, I legged it into the kitchen and grabbed a few bits from the cupboards to offer any potential trick-or-treaters. But when I answered the door, Mars bars in hand, there was no one there. Maybe I'd just taken too long grabbing sweets, or maybe it was just some knock-and-run type deal. But either way, there was no one to be seen. So I just head back inside, plonk myself down on the couch, and get back to digesting a ton of curry that I'd just eaten. A short while later, I'm still watching Netflix, about ready to doze off when something in the corner of the living room catches my eye. You know when you're so used to looking at a certain something that just the oddest little difference catches your eye? Well, I happened to notice that there was a little less of the orange streetlights outside coming through the little crack between the curtains and the window. Like this dark shape was outside, standing at the window. I sit up all nervous and it disappears from view, allowing me to see the orange light illuminating the street once again. Someone had been watching me. I got up, rushed to the cupboard under the stairs to grab my housemate's cricket bat, then edged toward the front door. I threw it open, ready to swing at whatever was out there, but again, there was nothing. I started to feel like I was going mental at that point, that maybe I was just exhausted from being sick for most of the week. I hadn't slept very well at all during the few days prior to Halloween, and I tried to reassure myself that maybe I was just a wee bit jumpy from being overtired. I decided it was best that I get an early night, telling myself that I'd feel much better in the morning. I did a bit of washing up, got a shower, then put on some comfy clothes to get ready for bed, but just as I do, there's another knock on the door. Only this time I can clearly hear some young-sounding voice go trick-or-treat from the other side of the door. I'd almost jumped out of my skin when I heard the door go, but the voice was weirdly reassuring. I mean, it was only trick-or-treaters, right? The worst that could happen was I got a few eggs thrown at me or some toilet paper lashed over the house. I walked downstairs, grabbed the handful of Mars bars I'd fished out of the cupboard, then opened up the front door. I was expecting to see a gaggle of school-aged kids, maybe accompanied by an adult supervising them, but there was just one smallish-looking figure stood in the pathway of our shared house. They couldn't have been any older than a teenager, but they definitely looked a little bit too old to be trick-or-treating. I didn't imagine that they'd been particularly intimidating otherwise, but the mask they were wearing seriously gave me the creeps. It looked old, like it smelled like disgusting unwashed latex on the inside. I'm not even sure it was meant to be a Halloween mask at all. It was like an old man's face with these tiny black eyes and a big white smile stretching from ear to ear. I made some derisive comment to him like, "Aren't you a bit too old to be trick-or-treating?" But held the handful of Mars bars out towards him anyway. I reckoned he'd just tell me to bugger off and snatch the sweets off me and leg it down the path. But he didn't. The lad just stood there, looking at me from behind the mask, not even moving to take the chocolate bars off me. I asked him if he was all right, starting to actually get creeped out by his behavior on top of the weird old mask he was wearing. But still, he didn't say anything. There was something intensely creepy about not being able to see his actual eyes behind that mask, and the longer we stood there in silence, just staring at each other, the more I felt myself begin to tense up. Then right as I'm about to just give him an awkward goodbye and shut the door, I hear a loud noise coming from behind me. I didn't really think the situation through. I just reacted, running into the kitchen at the back of the house where the noise was coming from, just in time to see someone smash the back door open. About 3 or 4 people then pour into the kitchen, all wearing masks, some armed with bats, others with these big knives in their hands. I turn around and leg it back towards the front door, planning on running upstairs to my room where my phone was charging to bring the police. But to my absolute horror, blocking the way to the stairs was the little lad with the mask on. Only this time, he had a knife in his hand too. He'd been in on this whole thing that whole time, and as he pointed the knife in my direction, all I could do was raise my hands in this "please don't stab me" type of way. "Get on the floor," he said, in this voice that seriously sounded like he was no older than about 14. Like he legit sounded like a kid, and that scared me even more. A grown man might have the presence of mind to not hurt anyone and keep the severity of their crimes to a minimum, but a kid, I thought he might just stab me up for the fun of it. I'd heard stories about gangs all over the world making younger kids commit violence to just sort of prove themselves, and that's what had me shaking as I lay down on the carpeted floor in the hallway, face down with my hands on the back of my head. I listened as the gang just completely ransacked the house. I couldn't see exactly what they were taking, but I heard them mentioning laptops and phones a fair bit, laughing to themselves as they absolutely raided each and every room in the house. At some points, I heard smashing and crashing noises as they just took it upon themselves to commit as much wanton destruction as they liked, giggling maniacally to each other as they realized they had the time and freedom to do pretty much whatever they fancied. I thought if I just lay there, keeping still and quiet, that they'd leave me alone. But that was just wishful thinking on my part. Obviously, they had to make their way through the hallway a fair few times, and when they did, they'd either literally walk all over me, which was painful enough, or they'd get in a few kicks here and there just to hear me grimace. I think the worst part of the physical abuse was when I heard one of them say, "Kick him in the balls, lad," to one of their mates. I tried to shut my legs, but they still aimed a few kicks between my thighs. Luckily, I was kind of tucked up, if you know what I mean, and there wasn't anything too delicate exposed, but still, the idea of getting my bollocks crushed under the trainer of some disgusting little thug had my heart practically jumping out of my throat. It sort of reminded me of that scene from A Clockwork Orange. They were there to rob us. That was bloody obvious, but they clearly took a great deal of joy in just being able to terrorize someone for a bit, and they seemed to get a real kick out of realizing that I wasn't from Liverpool. At some point I said something like, "Just take what you want. Please don't hurt me." And they burst out laughing. I wouldn't say I'm posh by any stretch of the imagination, but I'd definitely say I'm well more spoken than your average scouser. They started mimicking me in these little voices, stamping on my head and kicking me. I just lay there, wishing I'd never said anything. After what seemed like forever, listening to those kids ferrying out belongings into the alley behind the house, they finally left. But not before putting one of their knives to my throat and telling me that they'd be back to cut my head off if they so much as even saw a police officer in the area. Then as quickly as they'd all appeared, they just ghosted. I waited for a long time before I found it in me to stand up, and as I tried, my knees were way shakier than I'd care to admit. I went from room to room surveying the destruction. The place was a mess, but the thing that amazed and gutted me more than anything else was the sheer amount of stuff they'd taken. God knows how they'd got it all away from the house, but they'd taken the TVs, our game consoles, audio equipment, pretty much anything electrical that wasn't nailed down. It also looked like they'd taken pretty much all our trainers and had raided our closets for any clothes that took their liking. I wanted to call the police, really did, but with what phone? I'm almost glad I got a few kicks to the head, otherwise the sense of shame and humiliation might have been too much to bear. I ended up knocking at my neighbors' houses, but unlike me, they were way too smart to answer their doors to strangers on Halloween. It was probably the single worst experience of my life up to that point. I had to just go back inside the house and sit there in the living room couch with my head in my hands, just trying not to hold back tears. It was hours before any of my drunken housemates arrived back. Before that, I think I just sort of sat there at the kitchen table, in the one room that hadn't been completely ransacked, just drinking a few tins of lager, feeling absolutely shell-shocked, until finally two of them who hadn't polled returned home. And that's about the end of it. There's no real resolution to the story. The police couldn't do anything other than take down a list of what had been stolen in the hopes that any of the laptops turned up in pawn shops, but we never heard back about anything involving that. It was weird in that house for a long while after. I used to think the other lads blamed me for what happened, for not defending the house property, but I realized that was just the trauma from that night making me doubt myself. I had nightmares for a while, a long while actually, and in the end my parents paid for a few counseling sessions to help me get through my skull that what happened that night really wasn't my fault, how it could have happened to anyone. I got past it in time, but to this day, it remains the single most terrifying event of my entire life. Back when I was a law student at a prominent London university, I moved into a shared house in Peckham during the final years of my studies. Half the reason I was so keen on that particular house was that only one of the other apartments was occupied. The trouble with being in a student house is that they tend to be pretty rowdy places. You never know quite when someone is going to bring home a bunch of friends from a club night and spend the wee small hours blasting music in the kitchen or whatever. Obviously, that's not conducive for a good sleeping pattern, and the last thing I wanted was to mess up my important final year by living in some bloody party house. So with the help of some close friends, I moved all my stuff into the flat one morning with every intention of going upstairs to greet the person that lived on the top floor and the only other person living in the house. But at one point, as I'm moving some bags up the stairs, I looked up the stairwell and saw someone looking down at me with a cold, dull expression on their face. It was a guy, a rather tall one too, with short cropped blonde hair and very, very pale blue eyes. I mean, they were so pale it was like they shined out of his eye sockets at me, this rather alarming shade of icy blue. I said hi to him in as friendly a way as I could muster, but instead of returning my greeting, he just stared at me for a few moments before slowly backing away from the stairwell. Then I just heard a door slam as he disappeared back into his apartment. The person I was with just kind of gave me an awkward, amused look as we whispered our hopes that he wouldn't end up being a weirdo or anything like that. God, when I look back on it, it was such a hauntingly prophetic moment. If only we knew how right we were. The first few nights were nothing unusual, and I was actually relieved that I get the peace and quiet that I've been hoping for. That was until one evening when I'm sitting in my computer chair and doing some research on international trade law, and I heard something coming from the hallway outside. At first it didn't bother me too much, and I simply put on some ambient music that always seemed to help me concentrate and tried to ignore the sounds coming from outside. But as the night went on, they seemed to get louder and louder, and eventually I couldn't contain my curiosity, walking over to the door so I could get an idea of exactly what they were. It was the sound of screaming in particular, a woman screaming, and it was coming from the apartment upstairs. At first I thought the guy up there was just watching a horror movie or something, and that's what the screaming sound was from. But the longer I listened, the more I realized that whoever was up there was listening to that and only that, like to the point I could hear the audio file or whatever looping at a certain time. He was just up there, listening to the sound of a woman screaming in pain for like an hour straight. I know I should have just gone up there and asked him to turn it down, but the idea that he was just sitting in his apartment listening to the sound of a woman screaming for that length of time, my God, it scared the life out of me. It was hours before I was silent again. I'm talking like 1 in the morning before I could finally even think about getting to sleep. Questions were rolling around my mind as I was lying there in the dark. Like, what kind of person just listens to stuff like that for hours at a time? Or worse, what if he was watching something criminally violent? What if he was up there watching some kind of snuff film? I lay awake for hours, absolutely terrified of my new situation, one I couldn't just escape from so easily since I'd spent such a huge amount of money on the admin charges, first month's rent, and that sort of thing. I was so bloody worried, and it was with those thoughts echoing through my mind that I finally drifted off to sleep. I was absolutely exhausted during lectures the next day, to the point where my mates were asking me if everything was okay, since apparently I looked as rough as a bear. I told them I was fine, but that something was seriously weird about the bloke who lived upstairs. A few of them consoled me with tales of their own weirdo housemates, and that, as creepy as he seemed to be, at least he wasn't a perv who was constantly trying to get in my pants or whatever. And I suppose that, in a manner of speaking, they were right. But that night I just found myself getting pretty angry that this guy was so bloody inconsiderate, so I put on my big girl pants and marched up to his apartment with every intention of getting him to turn the volume down. So I rock up to his door, knocking on it loudly as I wait for him to answer. A little side note, I've dealt with noisy neighbors before. Usually the moment you knock, the noise turns down. They're embarrassed, apologetic, generally reasonable people. Only with this guy, the noises didn't turn down at all. I can't even describe how unnerving it was to hear what was coming from inside that apartment. I still don't know what those screaming sounds were from, be it a movie or a weird noisecore album or some other bollocks, but I'm telling you now, they sounded real. They were utterly blood-curdling, the kind of screams you only get out of someone when they know they're about to die. I was positively shaking with fear by the time I heard the door begin to unlock, and when it opened, what I saw was more unnerving than I could possibly imagine. The weird blonde guy that I had seen looking down the stairwell at me just a week or so before, well, I assume it was him anyway, was wearing a mask, one that I find hard to describe when I think about it. It was made of varnished wood, I know that, and it looked kind of like a death mask, like the cast of a person's face that's made when they've recently passed away. Only there was something horribly, horribly wrong with this mask. Something that sounds deeply unnerving. It was misshapen, warped, with indistinguishable words or symbols carved into it. But that's not what really freaked me out, because when he opened the door, he was also completely and utterly stark naked. I remember backing up on the spot, putting a bit of a distance between myself and the masked man before I asked him, in the politest way imaginable, if he would be so kind as to turn the music down just a little bit. He didn't even move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring back at me from the eye slits that had been cut into the mask. I just kept backing up, shifting my tone from polite request to outright apologetic that I'd been so rude as to disturb him. But still he didn't move. He didn't make a sound, he just carried on, staring at me. By the time I saw the scars that ran up and down his chest, I just ran back downstairs into my apartment and locked the door behind me, almost hyperventilating with fright as I called a friend who lived nearby and asked if I could stay at their place for a while. They were curious as to why I was so upset, and especially as to why I suddenly didn't want to stay at the flat that I'd previously been so made up with. But once I explained, they invited me around immediately and told me to stay as long as I wanted. From there, I contacted the police and made an indecent exposure complaint, but the officer I spoke to said that without any witnesses, it would be essentially my word against theirs and it was nothing to build a case on. They recommended that, as inconvenient and disappointing as it was, that it was best that I just stay away from this disturbed, masked neighbor person as much as possible. I ended up moving out of that flat as quickly as I could, going back with a few friends during the daytime to collect my things, and once again, the guy upstairs watching from up the stairwell, just staring again, completely emotionless. After that, I started to realize why the rest of the flats remained empty. I ended up graduating with a first in my law degree, and now I help run a law firm in the city of Birmingham. I remember my time in London well, but I tried never to think about that empty apartment building, ever, again. I'm a 20-something woman, American and a Francophile, fluent but not native in French. Since 2011, I've been in correspondence with an eccentric French guy I met because he posted a clip of a super rare telefilm on YouTube. We had a bunch of mutual interests and eventually met in real life so he could give me the movie on a flash drive. He also gifted me a book from his personal library that he thought I would like. We stayed in contact, and I recently returned the favor by buying him a DVD off Amazon. It's been good. Our conversations are enriching, and he's a sweet guy, just odd, as am I. He sort of switches between identities online, his real name, Jean, and then an Italian surname, and a fictional character from Gothic literature. He's very into dark romanticism. I knew him on Facebook under the name of the character, and for a while that was his email address as well, although last summer he started using an address based off his real name, so it was kind of a mix of the two. He can be hard to keep tabs on because he often disappears from Facebook without warning and then reappears as soon as he came. He's gone through 2 or 3 different accounts, all using the fictional character's name. It wasn't a surprise when he vanished sometime last fall, and I just kept my eyes peeled for him. Occasionally I do a search, and one day I found an account with his real name, although not one with the fictional character. There was no face pic, but that was typical. Since he sometimes uses his real name online as well, I added that person, figuring if he wasn't the right person, he would just decline my request / send me a message asking how we knew each other. When he accepted my request without asking me who I was, I figured it was him. This seemed to be confirmed when I first started messaging him in late February. Between then and now, we've exchanged just over 900 messages. I started things where they had left off, saying how it was good to see him back. I had just been thinking of him. I was going to email him something, but now I could do it over Facebook chat, etc. He greeted me warmly, and then when I sent him a YouTube video I thought he'd like, he proceeded to discuss it with me. He was a little less articulate than I remembered, but not so much that it became noticeable, except in hindsight. I think the incoherence isn't quite as glaring to me in French as well, since it's not my native language. And he was odd, but that was normal. In April, he returned to Facebook under the fictional character's name. We added each other and started Facebook chatting. I would chat with the two accounts indiscriminately. They were never online at the same time, so I would just talk to whichever one was on. Again, I noticed that something was off with Jean. He would say things that didn't make sense and then refuse to explain when I said I was confused. He would use flirtatious terms of endearment, which made me uncomfortable. He made a lot of typos that made it hard to follow him too. It was only later that I noticed all the typos, all the cryptic statements and non sequiturs. All the flirtation happened when I was talking to Jean, and not when I was talking to the account with the name of the fictional character. Likewise, all the most legit stuff happened with the fictional character account, like me getting his address to send him the DVD. He was just straight up nicer on that account too. I had some unpleasant arguments with real name Jean and only him. I didn't notice that at the time though, because there otherwise seemed to be a continuity between the two accounts. We discussed the same topics on both, and while the speech patterns were somewhat different, like I said, more lucid and friendly on the fictional character account, there were also notable similarities. The same Italian expressions got used, for instance. Real name Jean called me Bella Ragazza, a flirtatious gesture that made me slightly uncomfortable. Fictional character Jean, while making fun of a Roberto Alagna album cover, called him Bel Oyomo. They both used the expression no problemo at various points. They both complained about the French far right. It seemed seamless, until it wasn't. On Saturday, I saw real name Jean online and started chatting with him, asking him if he heard about all the stuff that had happened that week in the US. When I brought up marriage equality, he became very homophobic, which surprised me because I had known him to be a decent guy. We'd argued about non-binary gender before, but straight up vicious homophobia, slurs, etc., and it came as a shock to me. I started to fight with him and he became very hostile, saying nonsensical and paranoid things like, "If I come to your city, you'll hide with your friends so as not to show your face at the supermarket," and telling me to stop talking to him. None of this made any sense to me given our 4-year history, his past affectionate behavior, etc., and I asked him, "So we're not friends anymore?" trying to figure out what the hell was going on. He responded that friendship means nothing on the internet, which I found bizarre because we met in real life in the summer of 2011 and had been planning to meet again last year, except that he had been out of town. A while later, I saw that fictional character Jean had liked and commented on one of my photos. Another thing I only realized in hindsight was that all the likes and comments were from fictional character Jean, not real name Jean. I went to Facebook chat. Only real name Jean was on. I asked him why he was liking my stuff when he told me to stop talking to him. Furious, he responded that he hadn't liked anything. "Where do you see my name?" I said. "Well, not your real name, fictional character." He said, "So?" and told me to fuck off. At this point, I was reeling in confusion. What the fuck was happening? Was he having a dissociative episode? I resolved to talk to real name Jean when he came online to see how he acted towards me, and if he was civil, to confront him with his behavior under his other account. He came on early in the morning, and I rushed to talk to him, both deeply unsettled and dying of curiosity. "Hi, can I talk to you? It's kind of urgent," I said. Him. "Urgent? Sure, what's up?" "So when I was talking to real name Jean, you're the only one I'm talking to, right? This man is you." And I linked to the Facebook page. To which he responded, "Not at all. In fact, I don't have a Facebook account under my real name. This person is simply homonymous." He confirmed that he only been back on Facebook since April, the time when the fictional character account reappeared. He was pretty distressed to learn I'd been talking to this guy for 4 months, thinking it was him, and even more distressed to know that the guy was a dick, and I thought even for a moment that he also was a dick. You're probably wondering how it took me so long to figure it out, and all I can say is that because I took for granted the real name Jean and fictional character Jean were the same person, it never even occurred to me that they might not be. Them being the same person was the null hypothesis, and the idea that they might not be, that real name Jean might be pretending, was so incredibly crackers that it never crossed my mind, not once. You're probably still wondering how I could simply have taken for granted that real name Jean was my friend when he gave so many hints that he wasn't. And I have to remind you the degree to which he simply went along with everything I said. I would talk about stuff specific to my friend, stuff that must not have made any sense to the man I will now call Fake Jean, and he would act like he knew what I was talking about. The idea that he was lying, faking, or delusional was unthinkably bizarre.
This happened about a month ago. I'm doing much better now, and for my future jobs, I will never take night shifts, as the dark alone gives me the creeps. I've applied for many jobs because I'm the legal age for working, as I'm in high school. I'm in desperate need of money, and I need to help my family out as well, so at this point, I would take any job I can get. 5 jobs accepted me, so I decided to do a trial at my first job that was pretty quick enough to accept, which happened to be McDonald's. I need to say that the staff and the manager were all very nice, and my friend also works there, which was a total bonus. The only really downfall working there was probably the customers, which my friend agreed. But anyway, I didn't really know what to pick for the shifts, or even if I wanted the job, so I asked for a practice shift. My manager happily agreed and let me choose my times. Instead of daytime shift, I chose the night, which was a very bad decision, but hey, I needed to see what it was like working there anyway, so this will be easy since it's night, right? Well, I was terribly wrong. I got ready in my friend's uniform that she let me borrow, and she even drove me there. I'll be honest, the McDonald's was rather sketchy. When I say sketchy, I mean there's so many alcoholics and druggies around, and upon arrival it just didn't feel right. During the car ride, I had a gut feeling that it wasn't going to be a good shift, but my friend kept reassuring me that all will be fine. She dropped me off at the bus stop, which was 5 minutes from my workplace, and said that she would pick me up at 12 a.m. It was around 10 p.m., so my practice shift lasts for about 2 hours. I agreed and said for her to pick me up at the same spot that she dropped me off at. As she sped off, I merely watched as her car shrunk into the distance. After I saw it was gone, I started walking towards McDonald's, but while walking, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I didn't really think much of it because it was a normal thing. The person was probably just walking to their car or McDonald's or even the shops, but I had a really bad feeling. I felt like I was almost being watched, and I stopped for a second. The footsteps stopped with mine, and I looked behind to see a guy around his mid-40s just eyeing me off. I got really weirded out as he just smiled at me and then breathed very heavily. He was taller than me and he looked rather stronger and bigger than me as well. He was around what looked to be a few meters away. I quickly looked away and ran off to my workplace. There was only about 3 people working, my manager and my male friend. It was about 10:30 p.m. and I had already had a share of drunken rude people filling the orders up or even tried hitting on me. But he quickly left, and shortly afterwards, my friend showed up and helped me. He helped me out with most things, and I felt rather safe with him. He was actually an acquaintance of mine, but we soon grew to be best friends. After I was done taking some drunk guy's order, my friend pulled me aside and asked if I knew the guy outside. I was kind of confused at what he meant, and at first I thought he was just joking around. That is, until he pointed at the right window. My mouth went dry, and my face completely dropped. It was the same creepy guy that was following me before work. But I didn't tell him that. Instead, because I was an idiot, I kinda just laughed a bit and said that it was no big deal. He shrugged it off and we went back into the kitchen. It hit 11 p.m. No more customers were present and the same guy would not stop staring at me. At that point, I kind of just held my head down and just begged, hoping that he wouldn't come in. I could just feel his beady eyes run up and down my body. It was gross. It made me feel dirty. He's been there ever since the start of my shift and has been there for about 30 minutes, making it 10:30 now. I started to panic a bit as I was absolutely begging for him to not come in. In the middle of my thoughts, I heard something. My heart absolutely stopped as I then heard the sound of the door being opened. The creepy guy slowly walked towards my counter, eyeing my whole body until he was right in front of me, heavily breathing and almost drooling. His breath reeked like alcohol and cigarettes. He had a musky scent that, to be honest, nearly made me vomit. Red flags were totally going off, but I just tried to continue with my nice act. He wouldn't stop staring at me. I glanced at my friend who was in the kitchen. He was pretty busy, basically making sure nothing was getting burned. I turned my attention back to the guy and, no matter what I asked him, he was silent. It probably went on like that for about 5 minutes straight. That is, until he finally said something.
Such beautiful skin. So young. Short black hair. Such a nice complexion you have.
Before I could even speak or try and call someone over, something I wasn't prepared for then happened. The old guy launched towards me and tried entering the counter part, which happened to be the same part I was working at. He then looked at me like I was a piece of meat. Trying to climb over the counter wasn't easy for him though, eventually trying to grab me and getting stuck midway as I tried backing up. To my luck, I then slipped and totally landed on my butt. I tried my best crawling away, hoping that he wouldn't pass through. I was of course rather startled and afraid to the point that I couldn't even utter a single word. My friend dropped what he was doing as he screamed for my manager to then come over. My manager quickly showed up, which then made the old guy get back up and then flee. My friend quickly ran to my aid and he took me to the back room, which is what my manager told him to do in order to calm me down. Shortly after, we called the cops. I glanced at my friend as he looked pretty pale and rather puzzled, like he saw a ghost. My manager waited at the counter for the cops. That's when my friend quickly explained who the guy was. As it turns out, the guy was known for creeping on the female staff members while they worked. He would take pictures, ask for their number, offer alcohol, and even documented what they looked like. He was actually already banned from even entering the place or even being near it. The cops were already very aware of who he was due to his creepy behavior in the past. After the whole investigation and getting questioned, it was about 1 a.m. and I was let go. My friend was with my other friend while I got questioned, and on my way home, my friend held my hand and kept reassuring me that everything will be fine. Safe to say, I don't think I'll ever go back there again, and after this, I don't think I trust any night shifts. I think I'm gonna work at a different fast food place as well. So to that creepy old guy who's hopefully in jail, please stay away from me. We've lived in our neighborhood for nearly 4 years. A few houses down and across the street is a Filipino family. They're pretty nice, and whenever we see each other, we always have small talk and we know each other by name. We moved in right before I gave birth to my oldest, so they always ask for the baby and they love seeing them. We have even had meals at each other's homes before. This summer, they had an older family member, maybe 55 to 60 years old, come to visit. We noticed him right away because he would always go for long walks and lingered a lot. One evening, the mother of the family introduced him as her father. He had recently moved and would be staying with them for a while before heading north to her sister's house. He was pretty new to the US and spoke a little English, just enough to get by. He seemed nice enough, but as soon as we walked inside, I told my husband that he gave me a really weird vibe. I had never felt that way of any of the 7 other family members from the home. I've been in their home and shared meals with them. They're very sweet and welcoming. My husband also told me that he did seem a little off, but we just chalked it up to cultural differences. Fast forward about a month. My mother-in-law and my mother came to visit at the very same time. They're in the driveway with our son. I run inside because I'm pregnant and I suffer from severe morning sickness. I come back out 15 minutes later and they're having a frustrating conversation with this man. He was trying to get one of them to drive him to the store and he would use a food stamp/EBD card to buy their groceries and wanted them to give him cash. They both told him that they weren't interested, but he just kept asking and lingering. When I went outside, I called out to my husband to come out, and when he saw us, he walked away very quickly. Both of our mothers told us what had happened and how forceful that he was being with them. The next few days that I see him walking, we always wave and say simple pleasantries, but every time I would wave, he would take it as a sign to come over and try to have a conversation. I began to let him know that what he did with our mothers is very illegal and to be so forceful was really unnecessary. He said that he understood, but he would linger. It would always be at a moment where I was trying to strap my toddler to his car seat and I was rushing to get him to school. It would always take me about 10 minutes to get him to get the hint that I couldn't talk, and he would slowly walk away and just linger in our driveway. It eventually got to the point where I would watch to see if he had walked past our house on his morning walk before venturing outside. I really just hated the awkward conversation. He would always seem to round the corner just as I finished strapping my son in the car and I was getting in. I would wave and then jump in quickly and drive off. It just felt really off, like he was waiting for me. One of our neighbors across the street one night told me that she got a weird vibe from him as well. And again, he always lingered. She told me that he did similar things with her when they were outside as well. They were opting to hang in the backyard with the kids just to avoid it altogether. Now, I usually work from home, but one day I went into the office and I was then alerted by the Ring camera. This man was standing and looking in through our kitchen window, just peering, and I could hear our pit bull barking at him. When he saw our dog, he jumped back and I used the microphone to say, "Can I help you? What do you want?" He looked absolutely shocked and then scurried away. I called my husband and I told him to play the video. We both thought it was really creepy. Whenever we saw the family walking that evening, we decided to bring it up to his daughter. She spoke to her father and he claimed that it never happened. We then showed her the video on her phone and he said that he must have gotten lost. The daughter seemed pretty annoyed by him and the entire situation, so him being weird kinda calmed down a bit. After that I could see that his daughter was really annoyed by his behavior, and as they were walking there was a really heated conversation. She later told me that he tends to be overly friendly and he really means no harm, but she talked to him and he would leave us alone. I asked if he had some kind of mental issue or maybe Alzheimer's since he was always getting lost. She told me no and that he had always acted like that and that she couldn't wait until his sister was ready for him to be sent up north to her. There were a few other neighbors that had also complained to her and the homeowners association as well. Well, about 2 months later, I dropped my son off to preschool. I get home and I have to rush in because I feel really sick. Usually I leave my car door open, but something told me to lock it as soon as I got out. I did so as I was rushing inside. I would also normally leave the door unlocked if I was just going for a quick throw-up session, but again, my instincts told me to lock the bottom and top lock. When I was in the bathroom, right by the front door, throwing up my life, I then hear a rattling at the front door. Someone is turning the lock back and forth. Of course, my ring chimes and I then look at it in between heaves. What do you know? It's the old man and he's trying to get into our home. I go over to the microphone and then say, "You're at the wrong house." To which he responds with,
"Let me in, now. I want to tell you something."
Now, I kid you not, it was the best English sentence I had ever heard from someone who wasn't that good with English. I started to feel better pretty quickly and I was now on high alert. I responded with, "What do you want to tell me?" He looked right at the camera.
"Let me in your house, now!"
This is where I started to panic. He knew he was at the wrong house, but still he was continuing to try and break in. I respond, "Please get off my property. I don't feel comfortable with you here and I'm not letting you in my house." He then starts rattling at the door again really hard and tries to pull it open and then starts knocking on the bathroom window. This is where I get pissed. "Get the hell off my damn property right now. I'm not gonna let you in. If you don't get the hell out of here right now, I'm calling the cops." He then steps back, gives the camera the middle finger, and scurries off. He disappears and I run upstairs and see that he's simply walking back to his house. I let our pit bull out of our bedroom as he had been going crazy during this whole ordeal. I call my husband and he tells me to call the daughter and tell her what happened. I call her and I tell her what happened and she told me not to let him in, ever. She began to warn me that he's been very inappropriate and forceful with all of the women in her family, and she didn't want me to get hurt, especially being pregnant. She eventually comes over about an hour later and I show her the video. She's absolutely fuming over this and very apologetic, and she begs me not to call the cops. She promises me he'll be gone within the next day. The next day, he eventually flies out and his daughter told him that he's no longer welcome in her home. He now lives up north somewhere in Maryland with his other daughter and probably harassing other people as well. I honestly really don't know what would have happened if I didn't follow my instincts that day. I'm just really glad I'm okay.
Paid a few more dollars than any other job I could land, so I figured why not. I remember landing a construction job a year into working this night shift security job. I enjoyed construction a lot more and I desperately needed to get my life back on track. Being on night shift really messed with my mood and general well-being. The construction job I got had roughly the same pay, so it was a no-brainer even if I had to do a little bit more manual labor. As much as I disliked the job itself, I really liked all the people that worked at that museum. They were actually really cool. I went ahead and gave them my 2 weeks' notice and told them that I would stick around for as long as they needed me to find a replacement. They hired some skinny pale guy named Justin. When I first met him, he seemed like he was a decent enough guy. After all, it really wasn't my problem once I left. After a couple of shifts with him, though, I noticed that he was an extremely awkward and very strange person. He did this thing where he would change the tone of his voice mid-sentence. It was really strange and it almost made me feel like he had some kind of mental issue. Trust me, I wasn't being judgmental or anything, and if you heard it yourself, you would probably have had the same concern. Not that I thought that he was dangerous or anything, just a little out there with a possible mental illness. Maybe even a speech impediment. But anyway, it was my 3rd or 4th shift training him, and it was an ordinary night just like any other. As weird as he may have been, he seemed somewhat depressed or sad. I caught on pretty easily as he didn't make much of an effort to conceal it. We were making the usual trip throughout the entire museum, which was honestly a pretty long walk. We were probably about 10 minutes into it when I finally just asked him why he seemed so sad. He told me that he was really lonely and couldn't get a girlfriend. Again, if you had one look at this guy, you would probably understand why he couldn't get a girlfriend, let alone his weird personality. I tried telling him that there were plenty of fish in the sea and that he could probably have some luck on the internet. Online dating wasn't as big back then, though. He kind of shrugged his shoulders and just continued being sad. Whatever. I didn't know what else I could tell him. After that point, it became gradually weirder and weirder with each passing night. It was really strange. For instance, he would start going on these massive monologues about the most random things in the world. I only had to stay for a couple more shifts, but it honestly became really intolerable being around this guy. There was one night where he talked for at least 15 entire minutes about the environmental harm of pizza crust. Yes, literally pizza crust. It made absolutely no sense in the world. I tried interrupting him a couple of times to ask what was up, but he just cut me off and even started ignoring me after a certain point. When you are completely alone in a massive building with one other person, trust me when I say that their mental well-being is very important. I gradually began feeling more and more unsafe in the presence of this weird guy. Justin just seemed like he was going crazy or something. Thankfully, my entire shift with him went by decently enough. It was still awkward and moderately unbearable, but it was at least over. I started my new job and everything seemed to be going really well. I had completely forgotten about Justin and life seemed to move on. I didn't really think about that security job anymore at all. That was until I heard about an interesting story from my friend a few months later. I still kept in touch with a few people from the museum that worked there during the day. We were only Facebook friends, but that was enough for me. One of them messaged me to ask me what I thought about that guy Justin that replaced me. I was honest with her and told her that I thought Justin was really strange and possibly insane or something. And she typed back, "You're going to love this then." She then proceeded to tell me about Justin being fired for completely destroying an entire exhibit on night shift. I guess they came in at the morning shift and found him trying to put it back together. They watched the security footage and this guy literally tried to fight a dinosaur skeleton. I guess he had been acting really weird that night, judging by what she had told me about the rest of the security footage. But the interesting part of the story is that they somehow found out he was on antipsychotic medication. They figured that he probably had stopped taking his medication. That was all my friend knew, and that's all I know. It's really scary how people can stop taking their very necessary medication on a whim, and then potentially have a complete mental breakdown. I started wondering if he had been off his meds when I first met him. All I know is that I'm kinda happy I don't ever have to see Justin again.
This happened to me back when I was around 12 years old. I was going through some of my old cringy notebooks and journals with my girlfriend, and I found my old journal entry where I wrote about this day, and all the memories came flooding back to me. I used to live in what I thought was a really safe and secure private community. I wasn't allowed to just wander around too far from home without supervision, but because our neighborhood was a gated community, my parents would let me walk around within the gates anytime that I wanted, even if they weren't home. One day I was riding around the neighborhood after school when I saw a middle-aged woman crying on the floor of her porch with the front door wide open. I was pretty concerned and got off my bike to see what was wrong. She said that she was having problems with her husband and immediately asked me to come in so I could keep her company while she calmed down. My stranger danger sirens were completely going off, so I declined. She kept pushing me. Please, just for a moment. I just need someone to talk to. Now, I was raised to always respect elders and to be a good person, but I was also raised to know about stranger danger. So being a young naive kid, I actually felt pretty conflicted about whether I should go in or not. Ultimately, I declined repeatedly enough that she instead asked me to wait outside with her and then sit with her until she felt better. I agreed to this since I felt very safe in my own neighborhood. She asked me to wait on the porch for her while she walked into the house and visibly grabbed a couple of framed pictures from off the wall. She then sat down next to me inside the house while I was sitting on the porch just outside of her door. She then started showing me the pictures. One was of a kid older than me in the local high school football uniform, and the other of a man and the same kid. She went on to tell me these stories about how she met him and how they spent their honeymoon in Hawaii and how her kid was so good at football, one of the best on his team. She was very worried that if her and her husband got a divorce, she wouldn't be able to see her kid anymore. And then she started bawling again, this time onto my shoulder. This actually caused me to let my guard down quite a bit. For some reason, once I knew she had a kid, I felt a bit more comfortable around her. She was talking for a while though, and I was beginning to start to feel a little awkward as she was on and off crying on my shoulder, and I didn't know how to react in the situation. What the heck did I get myself into? I kept thinking to myself as I nodded my head pretending to listen. I was more concerned about finding a good excuse to tell her I had to go home. She kept calling me such a young nice boy and telling me, "You have no idea how important it is for you to spend your time with me," which made me feel a little bad about just leaving her. She kept telling me that she wanted to reward me and make me some dinner if I just came in, which I continued to decline. Finally, I told her I had to go, and she asked me if I knew anything about how to turn on her cell phone, as she just got her first cell phone very recently. I told her I did and I could help her out before I left. She told me to wait yet again, and this time left for quite a while. I kept thinking I should just walk away, but part of me didn't want to be rude, especially since she lived right around the corner from my house and possibly even knew my parents. My anxiety levels would spike as I got closer and closer in my head to convincing myself to just stand up and walk away. Then it would just dissipate and I'd tell myself, no, I can't just leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she brought me her phone, which was an Android. I had only had an iPhone 3G at the time, and it was my first smartphone, so I was a little worried that I wouldn't know how it worked. I just held the power button down for a second and lo and behold, it booted right up. She asked me then if I knew how to check text messages. I found and opened up the Messages app and there was only one number not saved as a contact in the app. She then pointed to it and said, "That's him. That's my husband's number. Read me his text." I opened it up. She had received basically the same text over and over again, just multiple variations on hello and please respond. She angrily said to me, "Read them to me right now. I want to know what he said to me." I then tell her. They basically all just say hello with a question mark. She just reaffirmed in a stern voice, "Read them to me." I started reading them. Hello, hello, please respond. She just has her eyes closed and she's nodding sometimes, commenting with things along the lines of, "That jerk, he does miss me. Well, screw him. He had his chance." She then turned quickly from this crying, distraught woman who was worried about her husband leaving her into an angry and spiteful person who felt like she was in the right. There was a couple of times when I stopped reading and I would ask if she wanted me to stop, and she would just snap at me, "Keep reading." Then I would continue. I started to feel like her husband was a crazy person with this many messages. I must have scrolled and read dozens of messages almost identical, spanning back days. My heart was racing. I felt like I was involved in something I shouldn't be involved in. I really wanted to go home, but every time I stopped, she would get really angry and tell me to keep going. That's when I came across the very first message that wasn't hello. "Stop messaging me, you crazy woman. Leave me alone. I've reported you to the police and got a restraining order. If you come anywhere near my family, you will be arrested." My heart sank. That's when I realized all the messages I had been reading so far were being sent from her phone. I paused in shock, and she again snapped at me, "Keep reading." I told her I couldn't because it was getting very late and my parents had dinner for me. She again just said, "Why don't you just come in for dinner? I'll make you something. You can let them know later you are helping your neighbor. They won't be mad, I promise." Only this time she was a mixture of angry and desperate. I told her they would be worried and wonder why I was gone for so long. She pleaded a couple more times for me to not leave her, and she started crying as I stood up. Honestly, I felt really bad about it at the time. I rode my bike home as quickly as I could. My parents had just gotten home from work a little while ago and asked me where I was. I didn't tell them the truth because honestly I was a little worried that they wouldn't let me hang around the neighborhood when they weren't home anymore. A few days later I came home and there were 3 police cars out in front of her house. My heart sank. I asked my parents later that night if they knew what had happened. My dad just said, "Oh, there was just a break-in or something." I later asked one of my neighbors to see if I could get some more information about what happened. Apparently, one of my neighbors fell in love with a homeless woman after inviting her in for a shower and a place to stay. He got her some new clothes and a phone and was trying to help her get a job. Turns out the reason she was homeless was because she suffered from mental illness. He then kicked her out when she started having delusions of his kid from a previous marriage being her kid as well. Honestly, he sounds like a really crappy person. She began harassing him after this, so he left the house to his parents' house and then sent the kid to his ex-wife's house. Apparently, he was worried for his ex-wife and his kid's safety. He had every right to because shortly after he left, she broke a rear window of his house and then came in. She had been living in the house for nearly a week before a neighbor noticed the broken window and called the police. She apparently trashed the whole house by that point and was arrested. I almost didn't believe it, but I went behind the house and saw the broken window. I guess the guy broke his lease and moved out immediately because he was worried she would come back after getting out of jail. I don't know if she ever did try and come back, but I really hope they disclose this to the new tenants. Honestly, I still get pretty freaked out to this day. Who knows what would have happened if I went into that house.
A 20-year-old male, and this happened to me in the winter of 2018, the day after Christmas. Me and my parents were on vacation in Maine, visiting my grandmother. As you can probably imagine, being in the state of Maine during the winter, it was freezing. We came up from Texas, so this was definitely not my climate, if you know what I mean. My parents had gone out to visit a friend who lived in the area, while me and my grandmother stayed back and watched some movies. My grandmother turned in at about 8 o'clock, and I eventually got bored of watching TV, so I decided to put on my coat and go for a walk outside. My grandmother's neighborhood has this neat stone maze, complete with angel statues and fountains. It was really cool, and something you really don't see a whole lot in neighborhoods these days. My grandmother's neighborhood was one of those 50-plus communities. I doubt you could have something like this in a neighborhood full of kids without it getting defaced with spray-painted pictures of penises or something. For me, I actually admired works of architecture like this, and was impressed by the amount of effort it must have taken to construct it. It was open from dusk till dawn. However, my grandmother told me that there was no neighborhood security during the holidays, and no one would say anything if I wanted to go through the maze after hours, so I did just that. I brought a flashlight with me, of course, and it took me about 5 minutes to reach the entrance of the maze from my grandmother's place. The maze wasn't massive, but it was big enough that you could get turned around, at least for a little bit. If I could give you guys a somewhat accurate visual of this maze, think of the maze in Resident Evil 4, where Leon had to fight off those dogs and gather puzzle pieces. That's roughly the same size as this maze. When I walk through this maze during the daytime, I would usually listen to my headphones, but something told me not to put them on that night, and it's a good thing that I followed my instincts. After I'd say it was about 10 minutes, I suddenly heard the sound of metal scraping against the stone walls. As soon as I heard the sound, alarm bells went off in my head. I froze in place and carefully listened for any other sounds. The scraping noise came again, except this time there was a deep voice that followed it.
"Abandon hope, all ye who enter here."
This sent chills down my spine, realizing that I was now in a maze, at night, with a possible maniac. The maze had these areas where a statue or a fountain would be. In these locations, there was shrubbery that lined the maze walls. There was just enough space between the wall and the bushes for a small person like me to hide behind. And since I didn't know the best route to exit the maze from where I was, I decided that the best course of action was to hide. I made my way into the area where a statue of David the Archangel was, and I quickly took cover behind the shrubbery that lined the walls. The streetlights located outside of the maze provided enough light for you to see your surroundings. However, it was still dark enough to obscure the details of objects and people. I feel that I needed to point that out, because from my hiding spot, I could see the corridor that I entered from. After about a minute, I watched a dark figure emerge from the shadows and make its way in front of the statue. I remember thinking how awesome it would be if the statue came to life and helped me out of this situation. But that thought quickly faded when the figure made its way directly in front of me. I could now see that it was holding something in its hands. I know that I said that you really couldn't tell any distinguishing features of objects because of the poor lighting. However, it was obvious what the figure was holding. Even in the dark, I could make out the distinct shape of a pickaxe. As the figure moved slowly through the area, I heard what I can only describe as teeth clattering. This only disturbed me even more as the dark shadow moved to the other side of the area and disappeared into the opposite corridor. After a few minutes of gathering my wits, I was reasonably sure that if I went back down the way I came, I could backtrack and make my escape. I cautiously moved out from my hiding spot to the corridor. I stopped in my tracks as I heard the sound of metal scraping again. It was coming from the opposite corridor where the figure had vanished. Before I could turn to look, I heard that same deep voice cut through the silence.
I see you.
I turned my head to see the figure running towards me, pickaxe raised above its head. That's when I took off through the corridor and frantically made my way through the dark maze. There was no time to navigate through the maze properly, so I just had to guess my way through the labyrinth as the lunatic with the pickaxe closed in behind me. After about 5 minutes of twists and turns, I finally saw the exit. I tore through the snow-covered ground and towards the opening. Just before I crossed the threshold, I heard a loud smash coming from right behind me. I gave a quick glance to see the pickaxe lying in the snow by the entrance. What I think happened was that my pursuer saw that I was about to exit the maze and decided to heave his pickaxe at me, but missed. As soon as I was outside of my grandmother's house, I pulled out my phone and called the police. But like with most stories like this, they arrived too late. Having experienced this myself, I can tell you that this outcome does make sense. My assailant failed to capture or kill me, so I don't think that they would stick around for the police to show up. The officers took my statement and did a thorough search of the area. They also had a squad car patrolling through the neighborhood for the rest of that night. I didn't tell my parents or my grandmother what happened until the next day. I figured that there was no need to worry them that night. I consider myself to be a pretty level-headed person, and that's mainly why I chose to share my story. Situations like this are terrifying, but you have to try to keep your wits about you. If I had lost my composure in that maze, I'm pretty sure that pickaxe would have found its way into my skull.
For almost a few years now, end of August 2019 to be exact, I had moved into an apartment in a different city because my mother, who I lived with in my hometown, passed away from cancer. I have moved here with my long-term boyfriend and one other roommate. We all absolutely love it here. The location is great. It's a 15-minute bike ride from my university, and it's located at a square with a grocery store, drugstore, lunchrooms, and that kind of thing. So we have pretty much everything we could possibly need to survive within walking distance. However, after just a month or two of living here, someone has started to ring my doorbell at exactly 11:05 p.m. semi-regularly. Sometimes every day, sometimes every other day. Sometimes there's a week in between, and sometimes there's a couple of weeks in between. But it is always around 11:05 p.m., and every single time, I get no answer each time I ask through the intercom who it is. Except for one time, but I will get to that in a bit. At first, I thought it was friends from one of the neighbors who accidentally rang the wrong doorbell. But after around the 4th time, I grew suspicious. And after more than those 4 times, I started noticing that it always happens at either exactly 11:05 p.m. or a couple minutes earlier or later. My boyfriend and my roommate both work at bars, was, so they work until very late and would usually only get home around 2 a.m. So each time it happened, I was always alone at home. It started to really freak me out after a while. When I first told them about it, they kinda shrugged it off and said it was probably a wrong dial, much like I thought at first. But when I told them that it has happened so many times, and sometimes even daily, they didn't really believe me and that I was just being paranoid and spooked. However, one night, when the doorbell rang again, I answered the intercom asking who it was. I heard heavy breathing. I was thoroughly spooked at that moment. I was again home alone and kept asking who they were and what they wanted. I couldn't make up from the breathing if it was a man or a woman, but I heard a strange mumbling or whispering, and then it was dead silent. They had appeared to have left. I put my apartment door on a double lock after that. I was so scared and spooked out. Thankfully, my roommate got home a little earlier that night, around 30 minutes after the doorbell rang. He could tell how upset I was. Now with the whole pandemic crisis, my roommate and boyfriend aren't able to work anymore. They now also witness the frequent door ringing at 11:05 p.m., so now they do believe me and agree that it's very odd and creepy. We have a balcony that looks down at where our apartment building's main front door is, but because there's a shop underneath us that always has a awning out, the view to the door is partially obscured. Every time our doorbell rang, me, my boyfriend, and roommate would go over to the balcony to see if we could see anyone, but we never could. I've also asked my neighbors from my apartment building if their doorbell gets rang so often, but the ones that I asked all said it's never happened to them. So a few weeks ago, my roommate decided to do some investigating. He went outside our apartment building at 11 p.m., standing across the street. He pretended to have a smoke while keeping an eye on the door. He said he did see a man who looked kind of suspicious wandering around our apartment building. He slowed his pace down significantly as soon as he approached our door, but when he spotted my roommate looking at him, he quickly walked away. We aren't completely sure if that's the door ringer, but that was very, very suspicious. Our doorbell hasn't gone off at night since that day. I'm hoping that maybe it will stop now, but there is a possibility that it will continue again in a few weeks.
After I had moved to London, the first flatmate I had legitimately tried to kill me. I think he was only keen for me to move in so I could cover all the rent he was missing, and after a while, petty arguments about cleanliness and money management turned rather vicious, and I was forced to find a new place to live. Once I found a place, I had to wait 2 weeks to move in, and although this definitely wasn't the right move, I thought I'd have to leave it until the last minute to tell my stupid flatmate because, screw you, that's why. And instead of waiting until the day before, I ended up dropping that little tidbit into an argument we had about a week before I was due to move out. He started playing the victim, telling me I was basically condemning him to being homeless, but if it wasn't for his silver spoon up the butt attitude to work, I might have had a bit more sympathy for him. We both smoked and did so in the flat, so the morning after our argument I wake, roll over, and grab my smokes to light one up in bed before facing the day. Not my proudest habit. I hold my hands up, but smoking in my room was better than facing him in the morning. I pop a ciggy between my lips, grab my lighter, but the bloody flint on the disposable piece of crap is bust. I try time and time again, but nope, it's buggered. So I roll out of bed, walk down the hall towards the kitchen, still trying hopelessly to get a light. Then suddenly, as I stroll into the kitchen, the absolute reek of gas hits me, and just under the humming of traffic outside, I can hear gas leaking out of the stovetop. That freaking psychopath had turned on all the gas in the kitchen, knowing I'd have sparked up first thing, blowing the whole flat sky high. I rushed to turn them off, opened all the windows in the flat, ran downstairs and called the fire brigade. My flatmate was interviewed under caution, but because they couldn't prove a bloody thing, the police had to let him walk. The landlord was much more understanding, though, and we basically made an agreement to cut him out of the lease while we arranged for locks to be changed. Apparently, he'd been looking to get rid of him for quite a while before the incident, so I ended up staying put. The only worry was the ex-flatmate, but since he was under suspicion over what he must have called an accident, I think he was too scared to follow up on it and try for any serious revenge. Still, messed with my head for quite a while after, thinking someone would be that vindictive over me just wanting to move out. Do your research on who you're going to be living with, people. It might just save your life.
This happened to me when I was 24 years old while home alone, primarily on Halloween night. During this time, I was still living with my parents as I was still a college student that didn't have a job with any money. My parents had to take my younger brother, who was around 10 at the time, to one of his friends' Halloween parties to have their fun. I had been invited to a Halloween party myself, but decided not to go as I'd came down with a mild fever earlier that day and didn't want to risk it going back up. Therefore, I was left at home to hand out candy for the trick-or-treaters, which I didn't mind even though some kids would be annoying. Throughout the night, I'd constantly be sitting on the couch, either playing some video games or watching Netflix, and would pause it once there was a knock at the door. Fast forward to around 10 p.m., Halloween started to die down. People stopped answering their doors and turning off all the lights until everyone was gone. Just as I was about to turn off the TV and get some shut-eye, I heard yet another knock at the door. In my mind, I thought it would be more of those pesky trick-or-treaters, but when I opened the door, I was greeted as someone who was at least 6'5", definitely not a kid. They had on what looked to be a zombie mask of some type, which I must admit was pretty creepy. The design was on point and the mask seemed very well detailed. I also noticed that he had a handgun sticking out of his back pocket, but at that point, I completely dismissed it as a prop. "Oh, hey there, happy Halloween," and proceeded to grab the bowl so he could take some candy. The only problem was that he either didn't acknowledge or care about the fact that he even said anything. In fact, I noticed that he didn't even have a candy bag with him. He just stood there motionless, slowly tilting his head to the side to, I guess, create more suspense. At this point, I'm a bit creeped out and told him that I had to go and to have a nice night, while closing the door and making sure it was locked. I looked through the people, and to my surprise, he was still standing by the stoop like a statue. I figured that it was probably some edgy teen playing a joke on people and that he'd eventually have to leave. And he did. An hour later, my parents had returned home with my brother and I decided to call it a night as I had class early the next morning. But there was yet another knock at the door, this time much more loud. I opened it and was greeted with two police officers with very serious looks. My dad then came to the door and one of them had asked us if we had seen anyone come to our house with a mask and a concealed firearm. At first, I didn't know what they were talking about. But then I remembered about my encounter. Their description matched the person I saw almost perfectly, and it was no doubt him. They went on to explain that the person I saw supposedly murdered his girlfriend and had dumped her body in a nearby lake. He was put in a mental institution a few years back and was released on, quote, good behavior. My heart dropped into the pit of my stomach as they said this. A few days later, my mom found a letter in our mailbox that wasn't in any sort of envelope. Written in big bold letters were the words, "You made the right decision when you locked the door."
I'm a female and 22 years old. I just recently got out of a pretty abusive relationship, and honestly, I wasn't in the best place mentally because of it. If I'm being real, it was difficult for me to now have to go home each night to an empty apartment with just myself. Anyways, this night my friends had decided to take me to a hockey game to get me out of the house and potentially get my mind off of the breakup. It was a Friday night, and we had been consuming a decent amount of alcohol during the progression of the game. In the arena we were attending, there was this bar where you could buy as many drinks as you wanted, within reason of course. and following the game, we decided to head there for a few more before we left. It was a busy night, so especially considering the game was coming to a close, the line was decently long. During the duration of the time I was patiently waiting, I had started to speak with a couple guys right next to me. Shortly into the conversation, one of them spoke up and asked for my phone number. Looking back, I definitely should have said no, but in the state I was in, I gave it to them. After we had finally gotten our drinks, my friends and I decided to call it a night. We parted ways, but instead of calling an Uber and going back to my apartment, I very stupidly decided to text the man I had previously exchanged contact information with. He responded almost right away, saying he'd head over in an Uber and take me back to his place if I wanted. Again, I made a stupid decision and agreed. Eventually he showed up, and we were off back to his place. Though, the drive was a good 45 minutes. When we arrived, I quickly realized we were practically in the middle of nowhere. We weren't anywhere close to the city anymore, and as I looked around, I realized no other property was in sight. Quite honestly, without context, I easily would have mistaken his house for an abandoned building. It was that bad. But regardless, being as intoxicated as I was, I quickly disregarded all my suspicion and followed the man to the front door. As we entered, I quickly realized how clean the place looked from the inside. Like, think hospital level clean, even down to the smell. Without even offering, he quickly poured us a glass of seemingly expensive red wine. I thought nothing of it at the time, and from what I remember, he poured it right in front of me and even drank some himself. Though, that was the last memory I had of that night. The next thing I knew, I was in a bedroom with the sun now clearly shining through the window. The noise of a shower running quickly filled my ears. I was groggy and dazed when I woke up, but I slowly began piecing together where I was, who I was with, and just the overall situation I was in. As it came back to me, I realized I needed to leave immediately. I frantically began to search for my cell phone, clothes, and wallet. But it was no use, I couldn't find them. I rushed out of the bedroom in the hopes to just leave unnoticed prior to this man getting out of the shower. But as I was leaving, my heart sank into my stomach. All of the furniture and floors were completely covered with plastic shower curtains, which I distinctly remember not being there prior to me blacking out the night before. I quickly noticed all of my personal belongings were placed neatly on the kitchen counter, alongside a knife that clearly wasn't a kitchen knife, but rather a hunting knife or something like that. My instincts kicked in, and I instantly grabbed my things and ran out the door. I ran for several minutes in a random direction, panicked and full of adrenaline. A good 10 minutes of full-on running down the road, and I finally stopped to call a friend to pick me up and take me back to my apartment. When I got back, I instantly blocked the guy's number, and to this day have never heard anything from him again. Now, looking back, I realize I should have contacted the authorities immediately, but for whatever reason I never did. It's clear I was not in the right state of mind at that point in my life, and this eats away at me daily, as I believe at this point it's too late for me to report the man, seeing as I don't even have the slightest recollection of where his house was located, or even his name. The detail that haunts me the most is that the only thing missing of my personal belongings was my ID. And this makes me question what the guy's true intentions were. Though, if I'm being honest with myself, I truly believe that man planned on murdering me that morning. The plastic shower curtains all over the apartment and the knife make it clear to me. But I guess I'm just lucky to have never truly found out. I was 30 years old. I'd saved enough money to buy my first house. It wasn't anything special, and honestly, all things considered, it wasn't in the best neighborhood either. But I was still proud of the accomplishment nonetheless. I'd met all the nearby neighbors in, I'd say, the first 2 weeks I moved in. Considering the neighborhood, I was surprised to discover they all actually seemed pretty nice. A couple of them even invited me over for dinner a few times. And having lived in different apartments all my life, this wasn't really something I was used to. Of course, they weren't all like this, however. 2 houses down from the house I moved into lived a man that was probably 50 years old. Upon moving in, every other night or so the dude would knock at my front door at some absurd hour asking for stuff. So, like, as an example, the first time it happened, he asked me if I had any spare bread I wasn't gonna eat. Another time he asked me if I could fill up a bucket with water, because his was turned off. It was just random, but somewhat understandable things like that. But I drew the line when he started asking me for money. I figured I had no obligation to be constantly meeting this guy's needs. I mean, I had pretty much just met the dude. I had started opening the door to his knocks less and less, but this didn't seem to have any effect on the number of times he would show up. Fast forward to a night a few weeks later, and again another knock. I had planned to ignore it, like I had grown accustomed to doing by that point. But as I looked through the people, I noticed the guy looked distressed. Seeing this, I decided the right thing to do would be to open up the door. So I did. I asked him what he needed, and what he responded with was not at all the type of response I was expecting. He asked me if I could come over and show him how to use his new grill. Now, this happened around midnight, which in my opinion was an extremely odd time to start grilling. But against my better judgment, I decided I would help him. I was pretty into cooking at that point in my life, and figured taking 10 minutes to show the guy how a grill worked wouldn't be the end of the world. I told him that I'd be over in a second, and that I just needed to put some shoes on. He thanked me and started walking back. A couple minutes later, and I made my way over to his house. I opened some gate and walked into his backyard. It was dark, so it was hard to see, but it was clear there was no grill. On top of that, the guy was nowhere in sight. Although his back door was wide open, I stuck my head inside and yelled out for the guy. "Yeah, I'm down here. I need your help getting some meat from the freezer." The muffled response came from down a set of stairs just to the left of me. I was hesitant to go down. There were no lights on down there. In fact, there wasn't a single light on throughout the whole house. I yelled down the stairs, asking him if he could turn on a light so I could see. There was silence for a few seconds. Eventually he responded. "No, they're broken. I can't do that." I knew something was off at that point. I yelled back something like, "I think I'm just gonna go, man." I kid you not, the second after I said this, audible footsteps started sprinting up the stairs. My flight reaction kicked in immediately. I ran directly back to my house and locked the door behind me. I pulled back a set of curtains and looked out one of my windows, but I didn't see anything. I was terrified. I thought about calling the police, but decided against it, figuring I really wouldn't be able to prove anything that just happened. For the next few days, I didn't leave my house for anything except work. During those days, I never saw the guy, nor did any late-night knocks occur. Exactly 1 week after it happened, I was talking with my neighbor across the street. The conversation eventually landed on what I experienced, and how I was planning to move because of it. But I was just met with a look of confusion. I was then informed that no one lived in the house I was talking about. It had been abandoned for 2 years. This prompted my neighbor to call the police. However, the police would find nothing inside or around the house. I moved out a few weeks later, so that's all I know. I'm not sure if anything else came from the situation or not. I still don't know who that guy was, or what he was trying to lure me into.
I'm originally from Mexico. For reasons that will become very obvious, I wish to remain anonymous. I used to be involved in the Mexican cartel. I mainly transported drugs across the border into the United States. To make a long story short, I was caught and cooperated with the feds in exchange for immunity and asylum. Before I go any further, you can go ahead and label me a snitch if you want to. I don't care. I personally feel pretty good about writing out a bunch of drug-dealing murderers that work for an organization that is responsible for destroying so many of my fellow Mexicans' lives. I was forced into this life at a young age. I've always hated the cartel, and was already plotting a way to flee Mexico with my mother and 2 younger sisters. You could say that it was a good thing that I ended up getting caught. The story is not about how I got out of the cartel. It's about the closest call I ever had during my time with the cartel. This happened during the early days. It was the summer of 2005. I remember the date specifically because I had just turned 18 a day prior. Even though I was barely an adult, I was a very intimidating-looking guy. I come from a long line of very physically strong men. I've been lifting weights since I was a child. I'm an even-tempered guy, and I don't consider myself to be an aggressive person, but I will put somebody through the wall if they piss me off. It was because of my physical presence and my piece-of-shit father, who was also in the cartel, made me a target for recruitment. When I first started out, myself and 2 other guys would drive around Mexico City and collect debts and packages from people who owed money to the cartel. or one of our distributors. It was on the 4th or 5th run that we ran into some trouble. There was this particular club we frequented where a lot of business was conducted. To make things simple, an exchange would go down in a back room, and we would come shortly after and collect the revenue and drop it off to our capo. So that night, we entered the club and began making our way to the back room. It was a fairly busy night for the club. This DJ from out of town was performing there, so people from all over were there to see him. To get to the back room, we had to go through the main dance floor to the opposite side of the building. There were some renovations that prevented us from using the back entrance. We got out onto the dance floor and started making our way through the crowd. When we were about halfway there, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was the barrel of a shotgun being pointed directly at me. I quickly ducked, and not a second later, I heard the gun go off. Unfortunately, an innocent girl who was standing beside me caught the bullet. She was shot at point-blank range, and I don't mean to be insensitive when I say this, but the poor girl's head was blasted apart. I remember several things happening simultaneously after the shotgun went off. All of the partygoers immediately fled the club. From my position on the ground, all I saw was a wave of moving legs. When I stood up, I saw a deserted club, my 2 co-workers with their guns drawn, cursing up a storm, and, unfortunately, the corpse of the young girl who was just shot. I assume that the shooter got away in the chaos. We quickly busted into the back office to find another bullet-ridden corpse. It was a club owner, who was our contact. We immediately fled the scene before the police showed up. I was never informed as to what happened with the club owner, and who almost took my head off with a shotgun. I was on the lowest rank of the cartel, and they kept us in the dark about a lot of things. I'm grateful that I'm no longer a part of that life. I would like to end things by saying a big fuck you to that asshole who tried to kill me and ended up shooting an innocent girl that night. And to all of those cartel members who got locked up because of me, you got what you deserved. And I'll see you in hell. This happened when I was 14. I was home alone one weekend while my parents were at a work convention out of state. I was in my bedroom playing Rocket League with 2 of my friends. To clarify, they weren't in the room with me. I was talking to them on my headset. During the game, I heard a thump from downstairs. This wasn't unusual because I have 2 cats who wrestle each other sometimes, and they often make a lot of noise while they're doing it. So I assumed that's what it was and resumed my game. But I slightly turned down the volume to hear if the noise persisted. 2 minutes later, I hear another thump, followed by what sounded like a grunt. Hang on, guys. I think I hear something downstairs. Go check it out. We'll be here when you get back. I began to make my way downstairs, thinking that my cats were wrestling rougher than they usually do. But as I got about halfway, I froze. I could hear what sounded like men whispering to each other, coming from the living room. I crouched down to get a small peek into the living room and saw 3 men, dressed in black. I felt my chest sink in when I saw them. I slowly went back upstairs, and of course, like in a typical horror film, the very last step made a loud creak. The entire house went silent. I knew that they heard it. Thinking on my feet, I quietly went to my room and threw on my headset. Guys, I need you to call 911. There are 3 men inside my house. What? Look, I don't have time to explain. Just call the cops and send them to my house right now. I'm being 100% serious. I then threw my headset on the bed. I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs. I had to think fast. I knew that if I locked myself inside my room, they would know where I was. So I closed the door and snuck over to my parents' room. leaving the door open so they wouldn't think to check it. I know the logic is flawed, but I had to think fast. 5 seconds later, I heard a pair of heavy boots hit the wooden floor, accompanied by 2 more sets. I then heard them get louder as they came down the hall and stopped outside my bedroom. I heard pounding on my bedroom door, followed by a deep voice saying,
"Open up, kid, before I kick this door down."
I lost my nerve and made a rash decision. I made a break for my parents' bedroom window and slid it open. I must have made a lot of noise while I was doing it, because I heard the footsteps coming towards my parents' bedroom now. I looked over my shoulder and saw a dark figure appear in the doorway.
"Get back here!"
The man yelled as he ran towards me. At this point, I tried jumping out of the window, but the man grabbed one of my ankles. Luckily, I was able to move my feet and slip out of my shoe, and I fell onto the small roof above my back porch. The man at the window jumped after me. I remember seeing a pair of boots coming right at me. I swear the man's feet would have gone right through me if I hadn't rolled off the roof at the last second. I landed awkwardly on my left ankle, but otherwise, I was okay. During all the commotion, one of the men ran downstairs to cut me off. Limping on one foot, I made it to the backyard gate before the man grabbed me and threw me to the ground. I tried to yell, but the man covered my mouth with his hand as the 2 other men climbed down from the window. The 3 of them began pulling me back into the house, but before they could get me through the door, I heard the sound of police sirens closing in. The men all looked at each other. Shit! They dropped me and ran towards the back gate. I limped my way to the front door and yanked it open and yelled at the police officers. Hey, they're in the backyard. 3 of the officers ran towards the backyard, while another helped me to one of the police cars. They managed to catch one of the assailants, while the other 2 made it over the fence. They threw the man into one of the cruisers as I was giving my statement. Soon, the 2 friends I was playing online with pulled into the driveway on their bikes. Hey Gabe, are you okay? Yeah, I'm alright. Thanks for calling the cops for me. The man that was caught was charged with burglary and attempted kidnapping. It turns out that the men broke through the basement window. I'm thankful that I managed to escape with only a sprained ankle. My lesson to everyone listening is to always follow your gut and never ignore any sounds you hear while you're home alone.
My name is Shelly, and 10 years ago, I wanted to make my own money because I was tired of asking my parents for money. I put in a lot of applications and I ended up getting hired at Chick-fil-A. I'm not going to lie, I was definitely excited because of all of the chicken nuggets I was going to be eating. Anyways, after I got hired, I started to get the hang of the job. It was pretty easy. I worked outside in the drive-thru line a lot because we were the busiest fast food restaurant in our town, and people really liked my personality. After working there for a few months, my dad's creepy friend Tyler would come there every day at the same time and go to the same drive-thru line, which was weird because I worked there after school and there were 2 drive-thru lines. The drive-thru line he'd always go to was mine, and he would always call me Shell Shell, which I've hated since I was a small kid. The thing is, he'd always order small stuff like a small fry or a small cookies and cream milkshake. A few times he came into the line, pull up to me, and then he'd say that he forgot his debit card, and he would just try and talk to me. I'm not dumb. I knew exactly what he was doing. Ever since I turned 13, he always acted weird toward me, telling me that I'm growing up into a woman, or that I look like a young woman now. There was this time when my parents were having a get-together with family and friends, and I yelled out to my parents that I had to pee, and I ran upstairs. I swear a few seconds later, Tyler burst through the door, looked at me and said, "Wow," and stared at me. Then he straightened up real quick and said, "Sorry, my bad," and closed the door. Like I said, he was weird. So we closed at 10 p.m., but we always take orders up until around 9:59. One day, we were inside cleaning up, and it was around 10:30 p.m. There were about 5 or 6 of us in Chick-fil-A at the time. I was mopping the floor, and a few of us saw a car pull up to the drive-thru, but turned around at the entrance because we put cones out there after 10 p.m. The car drove around our parking lot at least 10 minutes, and I noticed that it had temporary tags on it. After a while, our manager went outside and went up to the car due to it stopping in front of one of our windows every time it drove around. I watched the manager walk to the car as the driver rolled down the window. The window was all the way down before my manager reached the car, and to my surprise, it was Tyler, my dad's friend. He had a new car that I didn't recognize, but what made this very weird was that even when he rolled the window down, he never looked at my manager. He was staring directly at me, talking with my manager. I was standing behind the entrance door. He saw me looking at him, looking at me, but he never turned away like a normal person would. My manager walked back in and told me and my coworkers to hurry up so we can get out of here. I was the last person to get done with my closing, so it was just me and my manager. My manager told me to make sure the doors are locked. I told him okay, then I went to the bathroom. I figured I'd lock them once I'm done. As usual, I was on my phone while using the bathroom, and the bathroom door opens. I thought it was weird because my manager is the only other person in the building, and he's a guy. I yelled out that he's an idiot and he's in the wrong bathroom, but the thing is, he never left. It got weirder because I can hear him breathing by the door, but then I heard, "Shell, it's me, Tyler Poop. Are you in here?" I picked up my feet so he couldn't see them, but then he started to push open every stall door, saying my name. I texted my boss and it literally said, "Help, bathroom." Then Tyler got to my stall. He attempted to push the door open and then he laughed. He said that he knows that I'm in there. He looked in the crack of the door and said, "There you are." He then got down on his hands and knees, reached his hand under the door and attempted to unlock the stall. I kicked his arm and he said, "It's me, Uncle Tyler." As he said that, he proceeded to crawl under my stall door. I started to climb above my stall, then my manager burst through the door as I was screaming and crying. Tyler and my manager began to fight. I called the cops. After a few seconds, Tyler was unconscious on the bathroom floor. When the cops and the EMS got there, he was cuffed and loaded up into the ambulance. He was hit with a few charges and was recently released from jail. That situation just heightened my awareness of my surroundings.